Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you being here for the House Administration Education Committee. Uh, Started a few minutes late. Uh, Health Committee had a good run going on. Members, as we get started, we'll first of all have the roll call, and then we will see if anybody has any announcements. Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Representatives Baum, Carringer, Cassida, Sapiki, Clemens, Cochran, Darby, Gillespie, Hakeem, Haston, Lafferty, Love, Parkinson, Reagan, Vice Chairman Hurt, Chairman White. Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Yeah. Members, anyone have a announcement or recognition you'd like to make as we get started on our committee today? Representative Love.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if I could get the social work students from Tennessee State University and their professor, Dr. Cynthia George, to please stand. They're here and on their day on the Hill.
Reagan.
Those are our future social workers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. I see lurking around in the back, Mr. Roger Kane. Where is Roger? Did he walk out? Former state rep who you said on education. Roger, if you're out there, come on back in. Let us say hello to you. Yeah. If he walks back in. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, he sat in the House. He was in the Education Committee. Members, we always like to begin our committee with a prayer. Let's bow our heads. Holy Father, our Creator, we thank you so much for the abundance you give to us and for the opportunity to be able to address issues which concern our educational system in the state of Tennessee. You have blessed us greatly, and we strongly desire to be able to do the right thing for not only the parents, the teachers, the schools, but especially the children. Thank you for your blessings. Watch over us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. Members, let me give you a couple of things we're going to do. We're going to spend most of the time on the school funding legislation. But before that, we've still got about 12, 13 bills. We're going to do 4 bills that I picked out that shouldn't take but a maybe less than 10 minutes is my estimate. And then we get on the TISA bill, start on that. And we're going to start with item number 2. I believe that's Representative Sparks. You got a motion second. You're recognized.
Yeah, thank you, members. Thank you, Chairman. House Bill 2253 requires LEAs to classify school nurses licensed personnel for salary purposes. Amendment. Yeah.
Get my place here. Yeah, let us get the amendment and get things proper in order. You have an amendment. Would the amendment be which number?
016425.
You got a motion second. It rewrites the bill, members. Would you like to add this amendment to the bill for proper discussion since it does rewrite? Motion second. Any objection to that? Seeing none. All those in favor of adding the amendment 16425 on the House Bill 2253 indicate by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. We now amended. Representative Sparks, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. The last few years, we've seen more than ever how critical school nurses are in our K through 12 public school system. I think they're needed now more than ever. Just recently at one of our, I don't want to say better schools, but we had a student that was literally put in a coma. As we know that nurses are critical to the well-being of our students. A third of our nurses in Tennessee are placed on a certified salary schedule, according to a report commissioned by then Senator Dolores Gresham and Chairman Kumar. In fact, that the study reported that 2/3 of our school nurses hold an RN or higher level on education, meaning that they are similarly educated as our CTE teachers who are paid the same as their other certified staff. Chairman, I have someone who I believe is on the list that's with the Tennessee Association of School Nurses, Miss Danielle Kriminger, if she could allow her to speak.
Yes, sir. We have her on the list, Miss Danielle Kriminger. Without objection, we'll go out of session. Ms. Kriminger, if you would come up and occupy the the seat next to you. I mean, in the middle there, be fine. And if you would, make sure the mic is on and then identify yourself for the AV. And we're out of session.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, and our wonderful sponsor, Representative Sparks. I'm here today as an officer of the Tennessee Association of School Nurses to join with the TEA and give our unequivocal support to House Bill 2253. With me today, I have Shanna Groom, Marjorie Hogan, and Danielle Banks. We are all executive members of TASN. School nurses are highly trained, specialized, and licensed healthcare professionals. They directly impact student attendance and student outcomes. They serve vital roles in schools as leaders, professionals, and healthcare advocates all across Tennessee. They deserve to be considered certified by LEAs. Let me share why. It's imperative for the safety of all that a licensed nurse be available to students and staff at all times. According to the CDC, 40% of children have chronic health conditions. Those conditions create healthcare emergencies that require immediate attention. And then according to the Tennessee Department of Education, all students with a chronic healthcare condition should have an assessment by a school nurse. That's on page 5 of our state guidelines. The guidelines go on to tell you that it's warranted by the child's condition or diagnosis that an individual healthcare plan, we call those IHPs, will be completed by the registered nurse and reviewed annually or sooner as needed. The days of Band-Aids and boo-boo nursing are gone. Today's nurses are taking care of students that are much more medically complex. Examples of what we're doing on a daily basis are tube feedings, tracheostomy care and suction, urinary catheterizations, ostomy care, managing life-threatening allergies, diabetes management and insulin administration, adrenal insufficiency management and education, medication administration, asthma. We're COVID coordinators, pandemic leaders, and frontline heroes. Emergency first responders, we attend and advise in IEP meetings and 504 meetings. We create those IHPs I was talking about. We're on the suicide and mental health support committees, and we monitor immunization compliance. They're responsible for the education of school staff on health-related issues. And I guess this is kind of interesting to me. Consider that. It's mandated in multiple TCA codes that a school nurse provide trainings to our staff, teachers, and administrators. So in short, our nurses that are currently considered classified are educating our certified staff. School nurses hold a license from the Tennessee Department of Health. They're required to attend a rigorous nursing curriculum from an accredited institution. They have to pass a difficult state board that's nationally recognized and called NCLEX, and they're required to meet certain criteria to renew their licenses biannually. Their roles in schools are as a professional. Another thing I'd like you to know is that the Tennessee Department of Education defines a school nurse as a professional licensed as a registered nurse by the Tennessee Board of Nursing as part of the school education team. School nurses manage the school health services in collaboration with their supervising personnel, principal, and superintendent. That says volumes. Without certification status, school nurses are leaving the schools to work in other settings with higher salaries and better benefits. We respectfully ask that this committee support this bill, and we stand ready to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Gruinger. Members, anyone have a question of our guest? I see none, but thank you so much for that report. We appreciate you being here to help Representative Sparks. He always needs all the help he can get.
You know,
All righty. Seeing no other questions, we're back in session. Representative, we got a question called. Any objection to the question? You for serious, or you were just raising your hand? Okay. Thank you. Any objection to the question? Hearing none. All those in favor of House Bill 2253 going to Finance, Ways, and Means indicate by saying aye. Opposed? How's that? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Representative Parks and the members.
Representative Powers, here you are. You have 2226. We think we can work on that one. Got a motion second. I do not, let's see. No amendments on this.
No amendments.
You got a motion second. Go ahead and explain your bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. A lot of you look familiar from earlier today. House Bill 2226 is regarding the middle college program that is operated by 2-year post-secondary institutions in partnerships with LEAs. It permits students in the fall of their junior year of high school to enter into a two-year institution and earn a high school diploma and an associate's degree at the same time. A lot of these people even graduate from college with an associate's degree before they graduate from high school. 95% of the students who complete the program continue on to get a four-year degree. This bill would raise the middle college scholarship from $1,250 to $1,625 per semester. Currently, it costs about $2,000 per semester plus the books and fees that go along with it. So they still got a lot of skin in the game. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I renew my motion. Be glad to take any questions.
Okay, this is a bill that the Miller College is very important with CTE. Any questions, comments, to Representative Powers? Question been called. Objection? Hearing none. All those in favor of 2226 going out to Finance, Ways and Means indicate by saying aye. Opposed? Ayes have it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, sir. Representative Ogles, would you like to take care of House Bill 2729, item number 4 on the calendar? You got a motion second, but you do have an amendment. Would you give us the correct code?
Thank you, Chairman. I believe that's 014574.
754.
I'm dyslexic, so it's
Okay.
whatever you say.
Oh, we can help you. We can help you in here.
Haven't helped me so far.
You got a motion second. This does rewrite the bill, members. Would you like to add it to the bill before we have discussion? Motion's add. Any objection? Hearing none. All those in favor of adding Amendment 14754 to House Bill 2729 indicate by saying aye. Opposed? Let's have it. Okay, you're amended. Go ahead and tell us what we're doing.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. This is requesting a TASER study to look at the best policies and procedures for how we communicate crimes on our college campuses. I believe you all got a spreadsheet that Chairman Curcio's interns were I'm so thankful that they worked on, where they looked up and studied each one of our colleges in the state. And right now we have somewhat of a discombobulated system. How we do things are not really standard statewide. And this would simply instruct TASER to look at that and be sure we're adopting the best policies and procedures statewide, especially, a crime on campus is a very serious thing. We want to be sure all these crimes are reported and handled properly, just for process of discovery and retention of data. We just need to ensure that those calls are stored and retrievable, and we have access to those for any legal proceedings or any civil matters in the future. Thank you, Chairman and committee. I'll take any questions.
Okay, and let me make a correction. You were right, sir. The amendment is 14574. We have a typo on our main marked calendar. So we are on amendment 14574, which is what you explained. We just got a typo.
The chairman's always right. So whatever you decide to go with.
Okay. We're good.
Okay.
We're good. Okay, members, with that explanation from Representative Ogles, any questions to him on his bill? You okay? Okay. Question been called. Objections? Hearing none. All those in favor of moving 2729 out to Finance, Ways and Means indicate by saying aye. Opposed? Ayes have it.
Thank you, Chairman and committee. Y'all have a great evening.
Thank you. We'll take up your other one next time. Representative Carringer, did you have a guest here? We've got room for one more, and that was going to be yours if you had a guest here. Okay, members, turn to page, item 9. This will be the last one on our regular calendar other than the TISA bill. House Bill 2341, item 9. You got a motion and second, Representative Carringer. I also see we do have an amendment.
Yes, I do.
It does rewrite the bill, correct?
Yes, it is 014893.
You got a motion second on your amendment. Any objection to adding it to the bill for proper discussion? No objections. All those in favor of adding 14893 to House Bill 2341, please indicate by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. Your bill is amended. You may
Okay.
describe it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee. House Bill 2341 was brought to me, and it requires that all school personnel, instead of only teachers, be trained at least once every 3 years on the detection, intervention, prevention, and treatment of human trafficking. And because in 2018, a trafficking situation was uncovered at a Tennessee public high school, the person who identified the situation witnessed suspicious behavior, tried to talk to the students, and initially wasn't sure what he was seeing. It took him weeks or longer to call the authorities to share his suspicions. He was not a classroom teacher, and under current law, no one at schools except for teachers are trained in detecting and intervening where there may be trafficking of students. And, this was very, very disturbing. And we just want to make sure that a situation where people that are on the front lines with students, whether or not they're teaching or not, are able to take this training to be able, to see what might be happening to report. So that's what we just wanted to make sure that we have provided the training for anyone that might be dealing with the students. So that they could report this. And so really what it does, it just says, if the LEA says that employees deal directly with the students, that's the ones that the local LEAs would be able to determine who deals directly with the students and who they would want to require to go through this training. So with that, Chairman, I'll renew my motion.
Okay, with that explanation, members, discussions on Representative Carringer's bill. Question's been called. Any objection to the question by Chairman Sapiki? Hearing none. All those in favor of moving House Bill 2341 out to calendar rules, please indicate by saying aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. And members, on your calendar, HB 2854, which is item number 8, has been taken off notice, so we can remove that from our calendar. All the rest of the bills on today's calendar, other than item number 1, will be rolled to the hill and will be taken up after the TISA bill, which is probably going to be next week. At this point, I am going to turn the mic and the gavel over to Chairman Hurt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, next up, we have House Bill 2143 by Chairman White. Can I get a motion in a second? Properly motioned and seconded. Chairman White, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd in committee. Members, the bill that we're now going to discuss is one that everybody anxiously has been talking about for the last number of months. Early last fall, the department, the administration all started working on a plan to see, after 30 years of BEP, if we could come up with a plan that would better fund our K through 12 education. And so we have before us the Tennessee Investment and Student Achievement Act. We commonly are referring to as TISA or TISA. I think we're pronouncing it different ways, TISA. And so the bill has been before us. There's been tons of work done on this last fall before we ever came into session. And we have been working on this diligently since we came in the session in January, working on different drafts. One thing I can say is that this discussion has been totally open all this time. We have been listening, the department's been listening across the states. Last week, TOSS was in town, and I spoke to many of TOSS, Tennessee Organization of School Superintendents, and I spoke to many of the superintendents at their morning breakfast. I've been getting letters from districts all across state, and our superintendents, from what I'm hearing, they are pleased with where we are on this particular legislation. For the past 3 weeks, we have let this bill it came before K through 12 under Chairman Haston. And for 3 weeks, this bill has laid in the subcommittee, and we've been talking about it, and we have allowed amendments to come forth from the general public as well as members in the General Assembly. We added 3 amendments during that time, and the bill that that is before us, the correct amendment, Mr. Chairman, is 16403.
Thank you. We have Amendment 16403. Motion second on the amendment. Mr. Chairman, you are recognized to explain the amendment.
Okay, that is the amendment. And members, I will let the commissioner and the department administration do most of the explaining since we're fortunate to have them. But this is the amendment that came out of K through 12 subcommittee. It is the original draft plus any amendments that were added during, they all rolled together. So 16403. Now, let me just say these words as we go through. I have been on the Education Committee for 9 years, and ever since those entire 9 years, we've always had people say, the BEP, we're not fully funding it, and on and on and on. And so I am very pleased with where we are with this. As a matter of fact, I'm even satisfied with what came out of subcommittee, and I'm getting that from many of the superintendents. However, we're still in committee, and we have members still have things they want to address. This, before I bring over the commissioner up, we'll go out of session, would like to say this for those who are in full committee, is that this is a student-funded formula as opposed to a resource-based funding formula. And the reason I like this is because depending on the type of students that you have in your school, and Commissioner will give a very detail on this, you are funded per student. And personally, I think this puts a lot of flexibility, a lot of accountability on our districts to take the money they're being given and use it on their student needs. Education is about the student. Education is not about all the other things that we a lot of times try to put before us. So they will be funded based on student needs. And there's 3 priorities: empower each student to read by 3rd grade, prepare each high school graduate to succeed in higher education or the career of their choice. You know, CTE is so important now. And then provide each student the resources to succeed regardless of the student's and individual's circumstances. And then it has 4 elements of funding. You have a base funding, which is basically what the BEP was, all these elements in there. And then you have funding based on student weights, depending on the type of students in there. And we get into that in the details. And then there is direct funding for things outside the base funding. And then there's an outcome funding. We fund our colleges based upon graduation of our students, and they get the extra money that way. This was if there's incentives where you have 3rd graders reading on 3rd grade level. By the end of 3rd grade, there's an incentive there for the LEAs to draw down additional funds. So there's a lot of parts that I'm really happy with. I feel very comfortable with it at this stage. But Mr. Chairman, if we could at this point in time, yes, sir.
Chairman White, we have before us Amendment 16403, which are all the amendments from the subcommittee rolled into one. So at this point, unless there's objection, I would like to get this amendment, or if committees will, get this amendment put on the bill to get it in the form that it came out of subcommittee. Members, any objections to that? Chairman Sapiki, you're recognized.
Just to clarify, so we're all on the same page, all of the amendments and all of the changes that happened to the subcommittee are in 16403, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Representative Love?
And I had a point of clarification also, so we're defining amendments that came out of subcommittee. Are we including all the amendments that all the members in the subcommittee submitted, or just?
Chairman White?
You're in subcommittee with me. Every amendment that we discussed was added in subcommittee. There's 3 amendments, and they were added, and then legal rolled them all into one. And that's where we have this amendment 16403.
Okay, I just want to be clear about the amendments that were accepted, right? Because I had an amendment, but I don't see it in here, but I guess it's.
Chairman White?
Okay, let me clarify. You're talking about amendments that you want to talk about in today's full committee. that came in since subcommittee.
Representative Love?
Well, yeah, and we may be getting to technicalities and semantics, but these are amendments that were submitted by members.
This,
White?
this is what came out of subcommittee when we voted on it at that time. Any amendments that have been drafted and released since then are in today's discussion.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you for
Okay.
clarity.
Okay, Representative Clemens, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure that these were all, those amendments we adopted in K-12 sub were rolled into and with the amendment. I think that there was 3 amendments that made the bill that we looked at in the subcommittee. So the last amendment we adopted in the subcommittee that made the bill and those other amendments we adopted last week have been combined into this one?
That is absolutely correct.
Okay, so not the previous versions and the original versions of the bill.
No, this is the amendment that we adopted out of subcommittee that we all said in there. It was what we had been discussing and then what we added.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Any more questions on this amendment? Amendment 16403. Questions being called. Without objection, we'll be voting to add Amendment 16403 to the bill. All opposed, say aye. Oh, I'm sorry. What'd I do? Sorry. First mess up. Bear with me, folks. We're voting to add Amendment 16403 to the bill. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it. Amendment goes on. Chairman White, you're recognized.
Thank you. I knew I liked you for a reason. We also have a guest speaker before we bring up the commissioner and the Department of Administration that we may want to recognize that want to speak on the bill also.
Will do. And I'll take a second here as chairman to acknowledge, folks, we have a big bill before us, a lot of discussion to be had today. And I know there's a lot of questions. So what I'll ask as we move forward as members, please be respectful of other members and the questions they have. As we discuss and have presentations and ask questions, if we have commentary, let's keep that to a minimum and get to questions. I know we all have statements we want to make, and that is understandable. We want to get there, but we also want to make sure we get to questions in a timely manner so we can get answers in a timely manner. So I would ask that respect be shown and of your colleagues as we move through today. So with that, we will go out of session, and we have a guest speaker, Dr. Kathy Beck. Make your way up to speak, please. And for the record, if you'd state your name and who you're with, and you'll have 3 minutes. Dr. Beck, thank you.
Okay. My name is Dr. Kathy Beck. I'm the Director of Schools for Cheetham County School District. Good afternoon, and thank you so very much for allowing me to testify. It is my honor to share with you my experience in regards to the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement Act. I did serve on the School Personnel Subcommittee. I've been in my position for 5 years, and I can certainly tell you that the biggest challenge I face on a daily basis is creating a budget that allows us to offer a high-quality education for all students in Cheetham County. In Cheetham County, we are surrounded by some of the highest paying districts in the state. Cheetham County is a rural county with very little local tax base to support a competitive teacher salary. We often hire new teachers only to be able to keep them for about 3 years. They then leave us and move on to a higher paying district right next door. The cycle is ongoing. Having the additional funding that TISA would offer would help us to recruit and retain high-quality teachers, and this in turn would enable us to ensure that all students, regardless of location or learning need, are served at a high level. Prior to the ESSER funding from the federal government, our budget did not allow us to meet the recommended nurse-to-pupil ratio. Once ESSER goes away without TISA, we will not be able to meet this ratio. We had a student, he was 6 years old, and he went into an elementary office to see the nurse. We were lucky in that we have 9 nurses now to serve 13 schools. He was complaining of pain in his jaw, and as the nurse that was there began to examine him, she started applying the stroke protocol as she was concerned with his symptoms. He was 6 years old, and he was having a brain aneurysm in the office of our elementary school. If the nurse had not been there that day to apply the stroke protocol, that little child would not have made it out of the office. When I took this job 5 years ago, I learned that Cheatham County did not have the funding for high-quality curriculum. We did not have curriculum for any of the core subjects. Our county commission then approved for a one-time allotment for me to be able to purchase curriculum in ELA and math. ESSER then gave us the ability to purchase high-quality curriculum for social studies and science. And again, when ESSER goes away without TISA, I will not have the ability to continue to update curriculum in any subject. TISA offers a recurring fund so that all of the students in Cheatham County are assured a guaranteed and viable curriculum aligned to current standards. This helps supports access for all students and raises the bar so that all students can meet high expectations and have the opportunity to be competitive for entry into a university, a trade school, or a job. Cheatham County is a best for all school district. Our ESSER budget went for instructional materials and personnel to move the needle for student achievement. When ESSER goes away, we will greatly struggle to continue to provide for the most basic needs that other districts take for granted. TISA will give us the ability to continue serving our students instructionally in the highest quality possible and to meet the high expectations for the state of Tennessee. If we want to be competitive on the educational stage across the nation, we must approve funding for education. We must not delay. This is the investment needed for our state, for our children, and for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beck. Members, any questions for our guest today? Representative Clemens, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. How many teachers do you currently pay for outside the BEP?
It's 25% of our overall staff. It's about 100.
Outside the BEP currently?
Yes, outside the BP, it's about 100.
And how much money are you expected to get an increase as a result of this bill?
It comes to approximately 4.2 million per year.
4.2. And how do you intend to invest or spend that?
Certainly, we will raise teacher salaries. We will be able to make sure that we have nurses to meet the ratio. We will be able to put things in such as make sure we have counselors for everyone. We have an elementary school that is larger than 2 of our high schools, and it does not have, up until recently with the ESSER funding, an assistant principal. So we will be able to address things like that other school districts take for granted. Art teachers, we did not have art teachers in elementary. Most basic things that we would want to put in place to make sure that all students have a high quality education, we will be able to do with this funding.
Representative Clemens, you recognize.
Thank you. Do you currently have any charter schools in Cheatham County?
No, we do not.
Have you accounted for or budgeted for the possibility of having charter schools in your county and the money that would flow to those outside of your traditional budget?
We have certainly looked at it, but at this time we have not had any applications.
You recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And what is your, looking down the road, so 3-4 years down the road, when the local match catches up, what are the, have you looked at putting any safeguards in place that is going to prepare you for any additional local funding you're going to have to provide at that time, and what steps you might have to take to provide the funding required?
Well, certainly when we do not have staff funding, we have to look at staffing. And so just trying to figure out how to best meet the needs with creative staffing, that would be the local safeguard that we would have. We would have to analyze all of our positions.
You recognize.
Do any of the uncertainties or gaps in this legislation that are contingent upon future rulemaking cause any concerns in?
I think it would be more concerning to me to continue in the current funding with the BEP.
You recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And what specifically flaws in the current BEP do you have? Like, what are your top 2 or 3 flaws that you see in the current BEP?
It certainly is just not a big enough piece of pie. As I said, when I got here 5 years ago, we did not even have textbooks or curriculum. Certainly that has been a struggle in regards to the budget. Our local sales tax is challenged. You know, Cheatham County is very rural. And so just like I said, basic things like art for elementary, music classes, any kind of focus on the arts, high quality curriculum, making sure that we have assistant principals in schools that have high populations. Those are things that we struggle with and other school districts take for granted. So for me, to be able to fund in just a basic way is what I'm looking for. The ESSER funding from the federal government really helped us fill in those gaps that we have had my whole 5 years here. And I'm very concerned when the ESSER funding goes away that we will be right back to not having to be able to keep up with the ongoing change of standards or bringing high quality curriculum in. Certainly looking at CTE programs and making sure that we're able to keep up with all of the changes in that. Technology is a struggle and a challenge that we've had to work creatively with. So for me, just looking at the very tenets of a basic education and being able to deliver it in the highest quality of a manner is how we will use that funding. And I think I would say that I speak for many rural school districts across the state of Tennessee.
You recognize?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last one, I'm sorry. And
Okay.
so I was getting at, I may have not been clear, the structural problems with the BEP, the inherent fundamental problems with the BEP themselves. I don't think anybody here would disagree, or I hope not, that the pie needs to be bigger.
Sure.
But this is really looking at how do you slice it up and placing a value on each child.
Mhm.
This bill alleges to do that. So aside from that, what structural problems, inherent flaws with the BEP specifically do you have that you think are addressed by this bill as it's written?
From my perspective, and please know, I am no school finance guru or expert in any measure. I am an expert in instruction, but I will say the BEP is so complicated that I couldn't begin to explain it to anyone. I never know exactly what to expect, what we're going to have. We were able to take the components of the TISA funding, and we ourselves were able to take our own data, plug it into the TISA formula generator. I'm not sure that's the correct word, but it was very easy to see what we would get. So for me in my role, just having the more simple model based on student needs, I think that would be much more advantageous for school districts across the state. To have a one-size-fits-all and a resource-based funding doesn't really meet the needs of individual students as well as this formula does.
Thank you.
Next on the list, we have Chairman Sapiki. You are recognized.
Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Where's Cheetham County? Help me out.
Cheetham County is right west. We are in Kingston Springs, Ashland City, right past Bellevue. Mhm.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
You made some statements here. I'm kind of scratching my head. I need some clarification on.
Okay.
You said your district did not have textbooks when you took over 5 years ago,
Resources.
but in the BEP,
Curriculum.
they're funded per the student. What was it, a choice your district made not to purchase textbooks for the students?
When I got here, it must have been historically because we did not have curriculum. Mm-mm.
You recognize?
Do you have textbooks now?
We do. We were able, as I said in my statement, we were able to get money from the county commission, gave us a one-time allotment to purchase curriculum.
You recognize?
You also said that you didn't have art teachers, or you don't have an art teacher in your
W-
district
In
around?
elementary school.
In elementary
Yes.
school?
Mhm.
Is that not funded in the BEP?
If it is, we've not been able to pay for art in elementary at all.
You recognize?
I assume you work with your school board,
Yes.
and the elected members of your school board, you put together a budget with them,
Yes.
and you're going to put together a budget based off of the $4.2 million increase.
Yes.
Currently, the people in your district, the citizens in your district are paying for 100% of 100 teachers.
Mhm.
Are you going to use the 4.2 million to make them whole so that your local taxpayers don't have to pay for them anymore? What is your goal on, in theory, what you're going to ask your school board to do with that 4.2 million? And then the follow-up question to that is, what you're going to do, how is that going to move your outcomes to where we get more kids proficient?
That's a big question.
Okay.
All right, let me think about the different pieces of your question. Certainly, we would use some money to help raise our salaries and benefits. Yes, we would like to be able to fund 100% of our teachers. As you know, with the BEP funding 75% of our teachers, it's always difficult for us on our end when we get the message that there's going to be a 4-point raise for our teachers, and then the BEP doesn't fund for that. So that would be really nice to have them all under one umbrella. Tell me again the rest of your question.
With the,
What would we
you're
do with
recognized.
what
I'll make sure.
would we do with the rest of the money?
Well, let's say you're going to raise teacher salaries.
Mhm.
You're going to try to make as many of those 100 teachers
Mhm.
whole.
Yep.
That salary and wages
Mhm.
of the existing personnel. How are you going to move Cheetham County forward academically?
Well, for one thing, for sure, this would give us assured money to be able to keep up be current with our curriculum and make sure that we have high quality resources and materials to use with students every single day. Technology has been a challenge. And so I think, not that I believe that schools should be taught totally with technology, but prior to having our ESSER money, we had technology in the one-to-one in our high schools, but that was, I went down to 7th grade, but that was it. We were able to purchase for the lower ones. But I think the big piece of it would be raise teacher salaries and benefits so that we can be competitive and we can retain our teachers and it doesn't become a revolving door to go to the higher paying districts, and continue with curriculum. That has been a struggle for us the whole time. Professional development, I think, is very much needed in an ongoing manner to make sure that we can pay for professional development, that our teachers, when they come straight out of college, that we can train them in how to provide best instructional practices for our students, have programs to make sure our ongoing progress monitoring, that when we take the TN Ready in April, that we have progress monitored all along and that it's not there's no surprise as to what our students are able to know, that we can make sure that we have applied interventions all along the way to better help move them toward proficiency.
Last one.
You're recognized.
Do you have trouble in your district with more wealthier districts stealing your personnel?
All the time.
Okay,
Final question?
I'm done.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else, members? Dr. Beck, thank you very
Thank
much
you
for
very
being
much.
here, and we hope we'll see you back soon.
Thank you very much.
Chairman White?
Thank you, Chairman. Can I make one clarification as we move forward?
We need to go back. We need to go back in session for that, Chairman White.
Okay.
We are back in session. Chairman White, you are recognized.
That's one of the members that on the full committee that weren't sitting on the subcommittee, because it was mentioned about charter schools. Charter schools in the original draft, if you were a charter school student, that was one of the weights. So it was put into the TISA formula. That is one of the amendments we adopted last week. Charter schools have been moved back out of the TISA formula, and now they would be directly funded like they always have been. So they are not a part of the TISA funding formula. They are not a weight that they were originally.
Thank you, Chairman White. Members, next we have on our list, we'll go out of session. And next on our list, we have representatives from the Department of Education and from the administration. So if y'all would make your way up to the tables in front of us. And I believe they'll be bringing us up to date on where we are at this point. And if you will, whoever begins this, please state your name and who you're with for the record, and y'all are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brent Easley, Legislative Director for Governor Lee.
Penny Schwing, Commissioner of Education.
Sam Piercy, Deputy Commissioner.
Mary Ann Dursky, CFO of the department.
Charlie Bufalino, Assistant Commissioner of Policy and Legislative Affairs.
Thank you, sir. So I will just start with some brief comments. And so to start and give an idea of where we are at this time. So we had a great opportunity of having, I think, a really robust discussion in the subcommittee. Want to walk through where we are with the bill, some of those adjustments and amendments that Chairman White referred to. So in TISA, it is a student-based funding formula. What it allows for is a base. That's the funding that would go to any student, no matter where they live. The weights specific to unique learning needs, students who are in sparse or small communities, and then certainly wanting to make sure that every student gets funded based on those individual needs. We go to direct funding. Those are looking at things like tutoring. One of the amendments that was made in the subcommittee was to include both those students who are scoring at the below level as well as those who are scoring at the approaching level on that 3rd grade TCAP. I think really important as we strive for ensuring every child is reading proficiently or at least proficient by 3rd grade. This additional funding will be very, very helpful and important for our school districts. Additional funding within that direct category includes K through 3, $500 for every K through 3 student. It also increases the funding for CTE. We know that that's incredibly important. We heard from districts in the subcommittee feedback and elsewhere that the cost of keeping updated machinery, equipment, ensuring that we have up-to-date programs, that's more expensive. And so you'll see an increase, $5,000 on average per student, and then certainly continues to pay for the ACT and the ACT retake. The last component of a student-based formula includes outcomes. One of the amendments that you will see includes within that outcomes that we must call a committee. We added some additional folks to make sure that it was very clear who would be on that committee, and those would be recommendations that would go through rulemaking process. One of the other things that was added in terms of the amendments ensures that the State Board of Education will either provide a positive, a neutral, or a negative recommendation through that rulemaking process. In that rulemaking process, it goes through a public comment period. It includes a significant stakeholder feedback. It would then go to the State Board for a recommendation before it went to the Government Operations Committee, at which point they would review any of the rules. So there are kind of 3 stages to that rulemaking process for all of the components in the bill, and that was a pretty significant and I think very important change. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. The only thing that I would say is I think that going through the number of weeks and a lot of the feedback and amendments that have been made, the bill is stronger. I do think that we have been able to be responsive, especially to some of the feedback we've heard. And one of the things I will point to, because it came up in some of the questions earlier, is around fiscal capacity. And so a significant change was moving back to the Tasser-Sieber combo. In doing that, we were able to provide updated projections to every school district. They now have those, both what the TISA formula would produce or generate for the students they serve. And then separately, the fiscal capacity and local contribution, we have that modeled out for the BEP and TISA from this year, so fiscal year 23 through fiscal year 30. I want to make sure all of you have those for your districts. We also have a binder that includes those printouts for every single district in the state. And it is really important. I think the graph helps to show this idea of a fiscal cliff is just inaccurate. When you look at the BEP projected fiscal year 23 through fiscal year 30, you can see in the charts exactly what happens to the local contributions year over year. It is really important to kind of dig into that within our local communities. We provided that information again to our superintendents as well as to all of you. You should have that in email. But controlling for that local contribution was actually one of the hallmark components in developing this formula, because we want to make sure that this is additional funding that goes to kids and benefits the students that we serve. And so that continues to be the priority, and I appreciate the time today.
Thank you. Members, any questions for our guest at this time? Or is there anyone that wants to speak anymore at this time? I apologize. Okay, members, any questions for our guest at this time? All right, for clarification, next we will move back to the bill, go in session, and start working through the amendments. I plan to ask our guests to stay at the table, so as questions come up as we work through these amendments, we can go out of session and attempt to get answers for each of us. Okay. All right. Well, with that being said, we have a question. Representative Clemens, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just a quick clarification. So these direct allocations that go to the LEA and subsection D there on page 11 of the new amendment specifies this, that they must be administered and allocated by the department to the LEA in which the student's a member for the duration of the student's membership. So that money, we're portraying this as a dollar value on each child, which is questionable. But so once the LEA gets that money for the membership of that child, can they do anything they want with that money in the direct allocation pot, or do they have to spend it on that child for that specific purpose?
Recognized.
And so I just to clarify, you're talking about just for direct funding. So like a CTE or the K through, okay, thank you, sir. So yeah, so it continues to be flexible funding. So if a student moves from District A to District B, January 23rd to January 24th, whatever funding is generated for that student remains flexible. It is district autonomy in terms of making decisions that are in the best interest of their local communities, similar to how it is under the current formula.
Follow up?
Yeah. So my question is, we're saying we're putting a value on all these dollar value on these direct allocations for, a charter school, say. Once that school gets that funding, it goes into a pot. Does it have to be spent on that child for that specific purpose?
You're recognized.
Yes, sir. So no, so the student and the specific needs of that child is what generates the funding. The total students and the funding they generate is all together, and then the district makes the decisions at the district level that they believe are most important for moving student achievement forward. Now, I think one of the things that you will see is that for the first time, and this is under federal requirements under ESSA, is that we will be able to report how much funding is generated at the school level based on the students enrolled in the district level, and also report on how that money was spent. So you will be able to see that crosswalk between, this school generated $500,000 for K through 3 literacy, and this is how much they actually spent on K through 3 literacy. So you'll be able to see and have transparency into spending based on the funding that's generated both at the school and the district level, but it remains flexible. The only exception to that, of course, is the ACT or post-secondary assessments that's outlined in terms of paying for the ACT and the retake. That will be a very specific item that the state pays for, and that's outlined in statute.
Representative Clemens, you final follow-up?
Yeah, I'm just trying to see how it's different than the BEP in that regard, because the BEP, the schools get these funds and they can spend them however they want. So I thought it was my understanding that that was problematic, and that's why you wanted this funding to follow the child. But now you're saying it goes into one pot and the school's going to spend it however they want. So I guess I'm curious as to whether or not we're fixing a problem that we're alleging to fix. To make sure it's going to the direct place and making sure we're ensuring those outcomes and that CTE is being funded, or, these direct allocations that are set forth in here.
You recognize?
Sure. And so I just want to split the difference in terms of how the money is generated versus how it is spent. I think what you just spoke to is how people choose to spend the money. What a student-based formula is, and why 39 states have already moved to this, is it's about ensuring that how funding is generated is based on the individual needs of students. In the current formula, it is generated based on averages and ratios. And I think we've given some examples where a district with 250 or a school with 250 students actually generates a completely different amount of funding for something like a librarian or a counselor than a school that has 275 students. So it should just be, if you have an elementary school and you believe that elementary school students should generate funding to support early literacy, every single child in an elementary school generates that funding. That's what a student-based funding formula does. It generates funding based on the needs of the student. That is all the funding side. I think what you're speaking to is the spending side, and it is just kind of a philosophical belief about local control and wanting to make sure that districts can make those really critical decisions based on the needs of their communities, believing that those closest to the students can make the most informed and best decisions for those students that they serve. Both formulas do that. I think the transparency in reporting on how those funds generated are actually spent, you can do that in a student-based formula, and you just can't do that in the same way in a resource-based formula.
Thank you. Next on the list, we have Chairman Sapiki.
Thank you very much. Let's go back and hit the charter school. And I appreciate y'all moving that down as we requested to the direct. Can you tell me how the 274.40 was arrived?
Can you clarify?
You're recognized.
Can you clarify what you're looking at, sir?
Well, by direct allocation to Murray County, it has listed charter. We don't have a charter school, but it has a dollar amount of 274.40 listed there. Is there a prescribed dollar amount per student that's going to go for those students?
Okay, great. I'm sorry.
Commission, you're recognized.
Yes, I got a little excited. Yes, sir. So we have that as the 4%. It is the same dollar figure. So if you did the 4% times the 6860, that's the dollar figure that would come up from it. Thank you for letting me clarify that.
Chairman Sapiki.
And so for clarification, being a funding bill,
Yes, sir.
what is the intent of that money for those students in a charter who go to a charter school? What's the intent of that money?
You're recognized.
Yes, sir. So the intent of the funding would be similar to the charter school facility grant that's funded outside of the BEP, and it would be to support things like rent for that charter schools might pay, or sometimes having to purchase a facility. It would be for that same intent as the funding exists now.
Chairman.
And based off of the base funding, everything that's in the base funding, those students that do go to a charter school will still receive the local match for that student, and they will receive the state funding for that student. And in that basic funding line, there is capital outlay included in that base funding line. So a student that goes to a public school, a little portion of that baseline will have capital outlay in it for them. A student that goes to a charter school will have a little bit of capital outlay for each one of their students. Plus, we're going to give them something on top of that. So far, am I right?
Yes, it is consistent with current practice.
And then,
Chairman.
And then I'll be quiet here, is on this issue. And so, like my colleague said from Davidson County, even though we're giving them that money for capital outlay, in the grant, we could direct it that way, but because now it's in the TISA part under direct funding, that money's going to go to that charter school and they can use it for capital outlay, or they can use it for something else they could use it for textbooks if they wanted to.
Commissioner?
Yes, sir, that's correct. And so currently, because when it's under a grant, you put restrictions on a grant, or you can put restrictions on a grant, moving as much as possible, again, from outside the formula to wanting it to be in one place, it would allow for that same flexibility. I will say that we typically have more subscription or more requests for that charter school facility fund for facility needs, because they have their basic kind of capital and then paying rent or whatever else they might need to do.
You recognize?
But nothing restricting them from using it for what they want.
Commissioner?
No, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list, we have Representative Cochran. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner. I think we've talked about this just a little bit. I think the formula is moving in the right direction. I think it's much more transparent, and just got a few questions just on practical application of it. Like once it's out in the field, it looks nice now. I just want to make sure that it's agile when it's out there. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask just a couple quick questions. One, just for some clarification on the portion where it's talking about direct allocations. So what we were just discussing. When we were looking at our projections, the ones that project out to fiscal year 30, are those direct allocations included in those projections, or that's kind of out, or that's outside?
You're recognized.
Yes, so those are included. The base, the weights, and the direct are all included in those projections.
Okay.
Representative Cochran?
Thank you. And then let me ask you this one. And so one of the first categories mentioned on direct allocations, so that amount can be generated from a rising fourth grade student who is determined not to be proficient in ELA. So I'm assuming, obviously that means that could generate some extra funding for each student that's not proficient there, which I understand. Tell me though, how do we make sure that doesn't become a perverse incentive? Where the more students that a school is producing who are not proficient, they're receiving more funding for that. I understand the purpose, but how do we make sure that doesn't have an unintended perverse incentive?
Commissioner?
Yes, sir. And I think a very, very good, fair question. One of the things is last special session, the General Assembly passed the Learning Loss and Student Acceleration Act. And I think one of the components of that is for those students who are not yet on track or mastered for third grade reading TCAP, they are required to, obviously there's the retention pathway. I think all of our superintendents will probably choose either testing retake. If you are below, you must provide summer programming and tutoring. So I think that because of the additional supports that are now required in law, I do think that this provides funding for those things. I will say, as a big step back, I do not believe any of our districts will be incentivized to have their students score lower. I think all of them are incentivized to accelerate achievement and show their great work. But from a safeguard perspective, because I think that's what you're asking for, we do have an accountability system, and that accountability system will have letter grades A through F. And so that is kind of that academic accountability to ensure that we are reflecting the good work that's happening in our districts across the state.
Representative Cochran?
And then just one final one, and this one is a little bit of a bigger question. So hypothetically, let's say in 2 years, the General Assembly, we say we want to give teachers a 2% raise on the state portion of funds. We want to make sure that they're getting a 2% raise, and we want to make sure that gets to teachers. Mm-hmm. If we say that, if we pass that, plug that into the machine. Tell me how that works in this new formula, if you don't mind.
Commissioner.
Yes, sir. So one of the things that we would, just from a step-by-step perspective, General Assembly says we want to make sure that we have $100 million for educator salary increases. So what we would do is we would want to say, here's what that would look like if you put $100 million in the base, and here's what that ends up generating in the total formula once it goes through the weights. We're able to say this is the state cost and this is the local cost. We can also do it if the General Assembly said, hey, we want to cap and make sure that we don't put any more than $100 million in new state funding. And we would produce for you a number and say, this is the number that you would be able to put into the base. Either way, you're still able to tag that $100 million for salary increases. It's just a matter of whether you would like to put more into public education or you want to cap it just at the $100 million mark as a placeholder. And then if I might, one of the things I forgot to say and would be remiss if I didn't, is that we have on the outcome side, at least the current proposal for outcomes does have a 20% outcomes essentially weight for third graders who are proficient on the TCAP, 40% for those who are economically disadvantaged. That is a higher dollar amount than the amount that a district would get for tutoring. So certainly that, I think that is just one other safeguard I would want to make sure to highlight.
Thank you. That's all. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Next on the list, we have Representative Love. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner, for being here, and thank you for answering our questions. I did have a concern after my colleague Davidson raised a question about the flexibility to spend the dollars that the child generates. For example, in Davidson, with economically disadvantaged, according to the numbers, 33,205 students generates 56,947,946.16. There's nothing that says that those dollars have to be spent to specifically address those particular children's issues in poverty and how it may affect their learning. Correct.
Commissioner.
The district would have flexibility in terms of how they choose to spend their funding. We do have that accountability system, though, that certainly measures performance of students. I also would again say that I believe our districts are going to invest in ways that are going to accelerate achievement, and I believe Metro Nashville falls into that category, of course.
Sure. And as a Metro Schools graduate, I support the school board and the school leaders. I have full confidence in them. My wife oftentimes reminds me that one of our obligations in making policy is to move beyond the person and think about the policy. And so it all makes sense now in 2022, right? With Governor Lee and you and your staff here and the school boards and the various people running our school districts. But then what happens when it all changes? Right? That's what gives some of us pause to say, what happens when someone else has all the autonomy? Right? And what assurance and what guardrails and safeguards do we have to ensure? 37208, Washington Post article about incarceration rates across the country, one of the most difficult zip codes to be born in. You're 7 times more likely to go to jail before age 30 in 208. I was born in 208, still live in 208, went to school in 208, right? And so my concern is if we don't put guardrails around, and I know there are other weights, right? Making sure that the kids get the services, not just this year, but for out to 30, right? 8 years from now. That's what gives me pause about just saying, yes, they have the flexibility. If the money's supposed to follow the child, then how do we ensure that the programs are for that child? Because oftentimes with I think Title I dollars, it's that child generates dollars and other students, of course, can benefit from it. But at least those dollars do address that child, right? And so that's my concern. I hope you think about that when we're going through this process.
Commissioner, in response.
Yes, sir. And I think I would agree with you. I think maybe a different take, though. If we think about making specific how people want to spend funds in 2022, we are missing the opportunity to be flexible about what those needs are going to be in 2030. I think 3 years ago, we wouldn't have expected the types of things we would need to spend money on during a pandemic. And thank goodness we have some flexibility in how we can do that. I think none of this prevents the General Assembly from coming back and making different decisions in the future. I think a student-based formula allows for that flexibility so that it can grow and evolve with the students who are in our public schools each and every day. I trust that our accountability system holds districts accountable for certain outcomes that you all have said you want to make sure we hit and in public schools across the state. And as our student populations change, our districts are changing and growing, and Tennessee continues to grow as a state, we have got to have a formula that grows with the state. That kind of flexibility allows for districts to make dynamic, real-time decisions in the best interest of their students. And that's why I believe that autonomy is so important. Without that, you hamstring our districts, so to speak, and it really says, this is how we think you should spend the money today. We don't know what that's going to look like in 10 years. Flexibility allows for a formula to grow with the districts that and the students that they serve. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Next on the list is Representative Parkinson. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner and team for being here.
Yes, sir.
Along the lines of what my colleague mentioned after a great spurring from his wife, can those funds be spent on anything outside of that subject matter? I know there's flexibility, but is it flexibility within that space, or is it flexibility for anything?
Commissioner?
They are truly flexible funds. And again, and this is something I would want to take a step back and just make sure that I'm being very kind of clear and transparent with you all. I believe that districts will make good decisions on behalf of their students. That is the foundational principle that I'm operating from, and it requires additional support to help districts in terms of professional development. We've seen great things happen as a result of the legislation that you all passed in early literacy, really transformational changes that continue to happen across elementary schools in the state. There are lots of programmatic things that can be done. And coupled with that, I believe that when districts are given additional funding and the flexibility to respond to the needs of their local communities, they will step up and make those really good strategic decisions, especially when we give them their support. But I also have to acknowledge that having been in every district in the state and 400 plus schools, a very, very small rural school and let's say in a very small community in rural Tennessee, and a similar middle school, let's say in one of our urban districts, they have different needs and they're going to need to spend their money in different ways. And I think from a good policy perspective, to the earlier comment, we have got to make sure that there is a formula that can be responsive to those very, very different needs across the state. And that's where that flexibility comes from. Understanding that I do believe all of our districts, if they get early literacy funding, they're going to spend it in early literacy because that's one of the things we heard in the feedback. Or if they get additional CTE funding, they're going to spend it on CTE because we heard that in the feedback. The only other thing I would comment on is the reporting side of the formula allows for a lot of transparency in terms of dollars in, dollars out. What did we get? How did we spend it? What did we think that districts would use it for? And what did they actually use it for? You all will see that every single year in a way that you can't now. So if in 3 years you don't like what you see, you can always come back and make changes. And that's one of the nice parts about having this type of a formula. And we've seen other states do that and think through as they see formulas evolve with their changing demographics. So I just want to offer those comments.
Representative Parkinson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for the explanation. But in the reporting, so if it comes back that a district used their literacy funds for something other than literacy, what's our response to that? How do we, what happens when we see that?
Commissioner?
So I think there's a couple of things that can happen. So certainly the reporting part of that is a really big part of local accountability. I think that what we will see is parents and frankly teachers and all sorts of folks will say, hey, this is money I as an elementary school teacher am supposed to be getting to support literacy. Why did you spend it on something else? So you can actually have a much more informed conversation. 2 is we do have an accountability system that measures academic proficiency and growth and improvement. So you'd expect to see, you didn't spend the funding on early elementary and that's what we thought it was for. and you didn't progress in early elementary either. So from an accountability perspective, that's something that happens both in our A through F as well as the reports that we provide to all of you, and then our work with the districts. And then third, if those districts have schools that are not performing, kind of the bottom 10% in terms of performance in the state, there is that provision within this legislation that allows in the House version an ad hoc committee to address those concerns. So you have three different ways that you could approach that in the current legislation, and then certainly there's lots of other programmatic components within statute.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't understand, why we didn't, especially in certain areas like literacy, why we did not specifically, make it so that money will go to literacy regardless, because we know that literacy is an issue for us statewide, right? And why didn't we just stand on that basis that this money is not flexible, at least this portion of it, and in some other areas that are I think extremely vital to the performance of and the well-being of student. And it doesn't maybe not have to be every area, but in certain areas, literacy, mental health, why we didn't stick to our guns and make it so that funding is not flexible, because there are some items that I think that just should absolutely be a priority because we suck in some areas, and I would have preferred rather that those areas where we know we need the improvement, we'd have stuck to our guns and saying this is not flexible. And then if we've improved in those areas 10 years down the road, instead of the reverse of what you said, or with the reverse of what you said, if we've improved in those areas 10 years down the road, then we come back and make the changes legislatively to relax it a little bit. But there are some areas that I just believe that we just have to be zero tolerance, step on the gas, and this is it. And you cannot use these funds for anything else but this area. Is there any thoughts on that?
Commissioner, you're recognized.
Yes, sir. And so I would say one thing, and just unequivocally, if you're putting money into early literacy, I genuinely believe you will see all of those dollars used for early literacy. And I just unequivocally believe that is what you will see, especially when we look at spending now and how folks are spending their ESSER dollars. That being said, I think one of the things that I would really encourage folks to think about is that's a resource-based formula. You are saying we as a General Assembly are telling local experts in education that we think you must spend the money this way, and we want to kind of box you in that way. I could see District A, who maybe at that school is seeing really high rates of early literacy. And what they actually find is that they're at 75, 85% of students who are at that critical third grade reading benchmark. And they think that, with this funding, I might get more bang for my buck if I invest in resources here. Maybe I want to have more counselors. I want to increase RTI. That's not necessarily direct for literacy. Or they're saying we are continuing to see great progress in literacy, but our math scores just are not where they need to be. That might be example number one. I can also think of example number two, where literacy rates and or reading on the third grade TCAP are below 10%. We have schools in our state that are below 5%, frankly. They are going to need more than $500 per student. They might want to shrink class sizes, and they're going to bring funding in from maybe the weights they get on economically disadvantaged. They might want to ensure that the additional funding they get for students with disabilities allows for smaller group sizes to really address the needs of the students that they serve. That is the type of flexibility we've got to have. And I would say if I put my elementary school principal hat on, I would want to ensure that I could make the most informed decisions for the cohort of students that I have, understanding that those cohorts are going to ebb and flow and change and evolve over time, depending on the community in which I serve. So it is operating with the belief that districts will make the right decisions, that we have clear, transparent reporting for accountability purposes. We have data to see, are we getting the return on investment in those dollars? And we are always able to make changes or adjustments if you are not seeing the investments in the strategic way that you like. But it is operating from that belief that flexibility is really important to meet the needs of a very diverse state.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Next on the list, we have Chairman Sapiki. You're recognized.
So let me follow up with a couple things. The intent with this new plan is to maximize our effort to move the intent of the legislation is to give maximum flexibility so that the locals can make the best decisions on what's going to move the ball for their students in proficiency, so that we can have more graduates that graduate high school that are on grade level, that can read, write, and do math, that can perform at the highest levels. That's basically the gist of it. And I understand the flexibility part here. What gives, I think, some of us apprehension here, we just gave from the federal government $4.2 or $4.3 billion to the locals with the intent of them to use it for learning loss. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was, and by the way, you have to send us a plan so that we can make sure that you're spending the money appropriately. Because in those ESSER plans that were sent into the department, there's been some conversations about some districts really didn't want to spend it on what the ESSER plan was for. And we had to go back and say, hold on one second, that's not what it's for this. And with this investment we're making, an extra $1 billion or plus that every year we give a pay raise, every year we give cost of living, every year we increase this budget more and more and more. By 2030, this thing might be $11, $12 billion because we're investing in the future of Tennessee. It would, for some of us, it may give us more a comfort level with this to say at the beginning, this is what we're intending to do because this is what we're wanting to get. As you get those results for us and show us that you're spending the money in the correct way, we'll give you more and more and more autonomy. Because if you're getting the results, like here's for instance, Germantown. Germantown is one of the best performing districts in the state. I'm sure most of the goals that we're going to put forth, Germantown can probably sit there and go, are you doing it? And with that flexibility, with a bill we just passed, they could take that money and use it to pay for upgrades on 3 new schools. And we're really not going to say anything because they're knocking it out of the park right now. Or an Oak Ridge, or a Williamson County, right? I think we really need to just, and this is where we may have to debate this as a committee, is do we want to put some type of guardrails on this thing at the beginning just to make sure that the intentions of the money that we want to spend moving forward, we're not going to be here 4 years from now and go, uh-oh, this isn't what we intended, and we're not spending the money the way we want to. That's more of a statement. I'm sorry. You can respond if you want.
Commissioner?
Yeah, and the only thing that I would say, and I know you've heard me give this analogy in a different format, but we do have an accountability system, right? And that is to say, these are the goals that we've set as a state, and here is how close or how far away you are from meeting those goals. I think one of the challenges is if we tell folks how to bake the cake, we say, these are the ingredients, this is how we want you to bake it, and then we're going to hold you accountable to how well you do what we told you to do. It really dilutes the ability for districts to say, we are going to make strategic decisions, and then you state hold us accountable to the outcomes for that. Now that is, again, I think something that I certainly can appreciate is kind of the two philosophies of local control and spending. We've always said this is a funding plan, not a spending plan. We want districts to be able to make those strategic decisions. I do think there are provisions in here that allow for additional accountability if we get to a point where those spending decisions do not feel strategic in increasing outcomes. But I think it's really important just from a kind of that local component that our very rurals, our suburbans, our urbans, our special school districts or towns, that they're able to be flexible to meet those very different needs, especially with some of our communities that continue to grow very, very quickly. They are going to probably need to make evolving and changing decisions on how they spend that funding based on how much change is happening in their local communities. And that would just be the kind of comments I would offer, really leaning on our A through F system as the way that we hold accountable for decisions and the reporting on the funding for return on investment.
Chairman Sapiki, you recognize?
I'm gonna hold this up so you know what I'm working off of. Okay.
Oh, yes, sir.
So Representative asked a question about. So let's give a hypothetical, and then I'm going to give you a why behind it, and you can answer that question. The base right now is 6860, and you have weights associated with that. And every one of those weights has a percentage that's a calculation.
Yes, sir.
I'm assuming we did something very detailed that came up with the 6860 to break that down as a base. And then we did research and figured out economically disadvantages 25%, et cetera, and all the weights are there. So that when we start this process, a unique learning need number one, for a student that gets debased, that unique learning need is going to get an additional 15% to address that learning need. And I'm assuming that because we made the 6860 into 15%, we figured out that that calculation will make sure that that LEA in the 23-24 school year will be able to meet the needs of that student who has that unique learning need number one. Okay? We come back the following year and we give a pay raise. And let's say that pay raise changes that baseline $200. Well, now that's going to be all those weights are going to be recalculated. That unique learning need number one, whose needs were being met the previous year by the lower number, because of the recalculation of the higher amount, that student will have additional funding for that unique learning need number one. But their needs have already been met last year. They're being met. Is an LEA required if we give a pay raise and those calculations are redone? Are they required to keep that money for that unique learning need on that student? Or can they say to us from the state, no, we are meeting the needs of that student because we did it last year. We have flexibility with that money and they could use that money elsewhere. Am I seeing that right? That if we give a pay raise, the needs are already being met, there's a recalculation, there's additional funds, and there's nothing that restricts the LEA from saying, wait a second, you got to use it for that unique learning need. Is there anything that restricts them from moving it elsewhere?
Commissioner, you're recognized.
So two things I would offer there. So first is if you look at unique learning needs, not all teachers are funded in the base. So that child who's being served, let's say it's a child with characteristics of dyslexia and they're getting a ULN 2. The teacher who is supporting that child with characteristics of dyslexia, when you increase the base and it increases that weight, that also allows for that teacher to see a salary increase. That might be what the district decides to do with that, to create that kind of equity across all of their educators and frankly, increase what that dollar amount can be. So that might take up quite a bit of that increase. I think secondly is that when you are looking at the needs of that child, when you have an increase to the base and it increases the weights, it does allow for additional supports to be provided. Maybe what districts are seeing is that, this group, when we had a very, very small RTI section, we were able to keep it really tight and do high dose tutoring within RTI. We saw students in that school accelerate significantly faster. Now let's replicate that. With this increase that we've received, we can now do that for more groups of students. So those are two kind of use cases I think you wanted to in the hypothetical, but really want to underscore that many of our teachers end up being funded through weights. Economically disadvantaged helps to fund even more counselors or nurses or social workers or school psychs, right? This unique learning needs helps us to fund more staff for students with disabilities and characteristics of dyslexia. So when you increase the base, it really does allow for that additional salary increase for all of our school personnel who do that really critical work with students.
Chairman, you're recognized.
Thank
Follow
you.
up.
Thank you. So I'm hoping everybody's listening to what you're saying, but there's nothing that requires them to do that, correct? I mean, if the needs are being met of the unique learning need one, and a pay increase is given, and the LEA chooses to keep all their teachers in that baseline, they can, or they could sprinkle them out elsewhere if they want to, because it's not a spending formula, it's a funding formula. They have the latitude to put the teachers wherever they want to put them. So far, am I on the right path there?
Commissioner?
Yes, I think the only clarification I would offer is that we do know that things get more expensive year over year. So the chances that you would be able to provide the same services with no increase is probably not where we are headed. So you think about the sparse weight, right? We can think about transportation costs, the need to change out school buses, the increased cost of gas, which I know a lot of our districts are thinking a lot about. Those are all things that when you increase the base, it increases, let's say, that sparse weight amount. And it allows for those rural school districts to ensure that they have really safe buses. We've had a lot of bus accidents, right? You want to make sure that you can change out that fleet and make sure that you can pay for that gas, et cetera. Same thing's going to happen when you think about the needs of our unique learners. You have materials that you need to replace, additional materials, resources, supplies, staff. Those are all going to be things that you either want to ensure that you are maintaining competitive compensation, or that you can replace the materials so students have that to learn with. And those materials do get expensive year over year. So I think there's a lot of reasons why when you put more money into the base, it allows for you to keep up with the other things that are funded in the weights.
Chairman speaking.
But we could handle all those issues with cost of living increases. So we could do cost adjustments to inflation, like fuel right now, right? We could come back next year as a general assembly and say, you know what? In the weights, there's transportation costs. We want to tweak that a little bit higher. So we have the ability to go in there and tinker with that baseline, right?
Commissioner? With the base or with the weights? I just want to make sure I'm...
On the base that has transportation costs in it, we could say, hey, the cost of diesel fuel is going up. We're going to increase that part of the baseline to be able to account for higher costs for operations. We could do that, right?
Commissioner?
You could. The only thing that I would want to caution on is that not all districts have the same costs. So you might increase that base, and you might have a district that actually does not have significant costs for transportation compared to a district right next door. And so again, there isn't like a place where you would say we are going to increase or tinker with this one thing. You would really want to make sure that you put in additional funding and you let districts make decisions that are in the best interest of their students, because some of our districts have hundreds of miles of transportation costs every day, and a lot of our districts don't. And so you want to make sure that you are really allowing for districts to make investments in ways that best meet the needs of their students, and certainly the changing times and or needs of their communities.
Thank you. Next on the list, we have Chairman Haston. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In subcommittee, we had a director that gave some testimony. He gave the analogy of, being a superintendent under the BEP is similar to being a CEO of a business, but you're told that here's your budget, but 90% of it's locked into this. Good luck with the other 10%. Mm-hmm. And we can, kind of go back and forth on if that 90% is accurate or not. But the BEP, the problem I have with the BEP is by design, it's restrictive. It has guardrails. And I think where we're at today is we're under a formula that is restrictive and has guardrails, and none of us are really thrilled with the numbers that we are seeing that are being engineered by this current system. And so I guess the point I'd like to make, or just and have you, mark on it, is, are the guardrails that we have right now such that it's created like a roadblock to education and innovation? Would that be an accurate statement?
Commissioner, you're recognized.
Under the BEP, I do think that it provides roadblocks, and I think it does at least prescribe, if not restrict, funding in a way where if you had more flexible funds, districts could make more innovative and strategic decisions with how they spent those funds.
Thank you. Next on the list, we have Representative Hakeem. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner and staff. You've shared a lot of great information with us today.
Thank you, sir.
I wanted to, I guess, ask, a new system with the same people, I think would be an accurate statement. I'm asking, and I guess trying to look at it from a corporate perspective, it may be like trying to turn a ship. It's going to, you have resistance. People were used to doing it a certain way. And I don't know if I'm hearing that there are guardrails in place to encourage them, to make a change. And I guess part of what I'm asking is, well, what you've shared with, I feel there's a lot of trust, and people are, quote, going to do the right thing. How do we verify? I mean, I don't mean verify 2 or 3 years down the road. Children are being served now. How are we ensuring that they're going to be served now as opposed to 2 or 3 years down the road?
Commissioner, you're recognized.
Yes, sir. And if I might, I want to give two concrete strategies that are in this formula proposal, and then also an example, a real-time example in our districts right now. So first and foremost, in terms of guardrails, I think, and how we get the support. There is a really strong professional development requirement that is in this legislation. That ensures that it's not just about understanding the formula and how you generate funds and where those funds come from, but it is about strategic funding and spending. So how do you spend the dollars you get to maximize student achievement? And there's also a section on how do you have fiscal accountability to ensure that when you invest those funds, you get a return on investment. That is for anyone who is part of that oversight and or development of budgets within our public school systems. I think that's a really important part of our professional development. I will also say that superintendents we have a statewide conference every fall. That was the number one thing that they asked for. So our superintendents are proactively, before the TISA legislation was ever proposed, superintendents were actively asking for that level of support. We had a session on that. Someone came and provided strategic kind of funding. It was in the ESSER, in the ESSER vein, but it was extremely popular. Our superintendents want to do the right thing and they want to increase achievement. And I think that ask that they made of the department that we are following up with professional development shows that they are willing to make the right decisions and want to learn more about strategic budgeting. This proposal allows for that professional development to happen across the state for our directors of schools, our school board members, our school and district leadership teams to really be informed. On the second part, we have reporting and accountability. Again, I think for the first time, we would be able to actually show return on investment. These are the dollars. This is how they were spent. Here's what happened with growth within our school districts based on how those dollars were spent. And I can answer those types of questions that I know you all have for me each and every year. But I actually want to give an example of how it is shifted right now in real time. We talked to a director in Northwest Tennessee. He said that what he did is when he saw the calculator online, the TISA calculator that Director Beck referenced, he went in and said, well, I don't know. Am I spending right now an amount on each of my schools that the formula would generate, or am I thinking about it a little bit differently? So he was able for each of his schools to put in the exact students enrolled in attending that school and show how much the TISA formula would generate for each of his schools. He then went and looked at his existing budget and found that no, actually, I might be putting a little bit more money over here, and I'm actually seeing that there are some outcomes differences. Two of my high schools who have similar demographics, one's knocking it out of the park on the ACT and the other isn't doing so well. And I might need to think about investing differently. He was able to have those types of conversations within his own district because he understood where the money was coming from. He had a tool to be able to figure out where that money should be generated and for which students and why, and to start to have conversations on the return on investment that he's currently seeing within the investments he's making now in his school system. That's just with the calculator online. So when we think about what can happen with really strong professional development over a 15-month period and additional funds to meet the needs of our students, I believe that we will continue to see strong acceleration in our school districts. And I do believe we will see districts working together to strategize as groups and cohorts because they work very well together to accelerate achievement. We are already seeing that, even just in working through the nuances of a funding formula change.
Representative King, follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It may be just two other questions I have. One, going back to an earlier example that was used of a child who, I guess, demonstrated some needs, that money is going to be generated or used for that child. You know, again, I feel like I'm hearing trust, but I guess my life has taught me to want to verify. And how are we verifying with it for that child?
Commissioner?
Yes, sir. So a concrete example, I, as a parent of two public school students, I would know how much is generated for each of my two girls. This is how much the formula generates for them. I'm able to see, and this is all hypothetical, of course, I would be able to see how much money is generated for their school. I would also be able to see how that funding generated at the school was spent at my daughter's schools. Next year, schools. So I would be able to see that in real time. So as a parent, I now have a different level of transparency and accountability. I can say, this is how much money was generated for my early elementary school student. Can you help me understand how you spent that money? And I think you can all believe and understand I will be having those conversations, right? So that I can do now, and I would be able to do, and I can't do that now. In the same way, community members are able to see, this is how much money was generated for my local school. Here's how much money was spent on my local school, and here's what it was spent on. Is that really aligned to the type of investments that we want to see? And now I can have a very different level of engagement and involvement. So that trust but verify is actually what happens now, but it is just trust, because there isn't a way for the state to report accurately on how that money was spent at the school level. It is all at the district level, and then very large grain size aggregations for school spending. So we can now verify under TISA. We cannot do that under the BEP. Under the BEP, you get funds generated at an aggregate level and average, and using averages and ratios. Then there is spending in 46 different components. But I, as a parent, I, as a teacher, I, as a community member, I, as a General Assembly member, I, as a principal, I might not have that same line of sight into how that money was spent and on which groups of students, and be able to link that to student achievement and acceleration. You can do that with a student-based formula, and that's what I think is so powerful. It is the verify part of it. Accountability is a completely separate conversation, but it does allow you to show return on investment as well.
Okay, one last question.
Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We talk about, I guess, verifying. Yeah, I'm trying to see through a shining head. But anyway. Dealing with reports. Yes, I'm talking about you, doctor. Okay. Dealing with reports and I guess trying to, as best we can, ensure that a child is being accounted for and served, we'll say in 6 months, in a year. The system that has been talked about being put in place, how early can we look at how a school is being served, and if there's progress taking place?
Okay, great.
Commissioner, you recognize.
Yes. So a couple of different ways. So I think it depends on the grade level, of course. For early literacy, we now have a universal screener. So we have those checks at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the year. For all of our other kind of 3rd through 12th grade, we are able to see that through the end of the year testing. That is what we have as the state level reporting. We certainly have kind of lag reports such as graduation rates, ACT performance, et cetera. However, what we see in terms of how our school districts are using data, the vast majority use interim and or formative assessments throughout the year. A number of them actually use the ones that have been created for free by the department that is aligned to our end of year assessment. So they're able to get those checkpoints throughout the year. That gives them data aligned to our state standards and frankly aligned to what the end of the year tests will be. So they're able to really track progress in real time. What we've seen, and especially through the ESSER funding, the level of flexibility that we are noticing in districts in terms of how they're thinking about spending their funding is at the beginning of the year, that universal screener data came in, the kind of ready for kindergarten data, et cetera. Many of our districts have already put in amendments to their ESSER spending to say, look, this is, or at least their funding request, this is not actually what the needs of our students are. We have to put in more funding into early reading, or we are seeing a significant decline in math, and we really want to lower the class sizes within those math blocks within our elementary schools as an example. And they are making those real-time decisions informed by the data they have at the local level. We'll be able to have those same kinds of conversations. This is a formula that, because it shows what the needs of the students are based on a number of different characteristics, districts will be able to have that strategic budgeting before the school year even starts and still maintain that flexibility to address the data as it progresses throughout the year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, members, we have 4 left on our list here that are all follow-ups from previously being recognized. So I'm going to start working through them and trust that will be some pointed follow-ups here. But if you're a member that hasn't been recognized and you have a question, please get recognized while we follow up with these members. So first, I recognize Chairman Sapiki.
we keep hearing a repetition of guardrails here. So maybe this might give us some comfort. We're not relieving the LEAs from doing any of the end-of-course testing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to roll
Sorry,
through this
was
real
that
quick.
That's fine. Go ahead.
We're not waiving RTI. We're not waiving any Ames Web or portfolio, however they choose. Universal screeners are still going to have to be used. All data collection and data points are going to have to be collected as usual. Anything we're doing right now in the classroom to gather data and to report back to the state is still going to be there.
Yes, sir.
Okay. There'll be another question on how that gives them flexibility, but we'll talk about that later. You said there were 39 districts that have already gone to this. Is 39?
39 states. Yes, sir. 39 states.
39 states. And this is not for today. This is just maybe if you can get us some data and information. Of the 39 states that have gone to this, can you look back at them and see what statistical changes they've had in outcomes in a 5-year time span? And then what statistical outcomes or financial changes to the distribution of funds between the state and locals or cost of education per student? Can you get us, some data on that so that we can see, hey, these are 39 states that have already done this. In 5 years, here's where they are educationally, here's where they are financially, so we can kind of get some more data to support what we're trying to do.
Yes, sir.
That's all I need. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next, I have Representative Cochran.
Thank you. And the discussion on accountability kind of just sparked this. So I think there are two different types of accountability. There's top down, but there's also bottom up. And you were kind of going to the same spot I was already thinking with one of your other answers. But I think and you can just kind of offer your comments on this, but I think when the BEP is so enormous that even people in government don't understand it, the public certainly can't use that to hold their school districts accountable. I do think one major advantage to this is that by providing people, voters, very clear information, and hey, this is the funding that was sent to your district. This is what it was supposed to be spent on. How did they do? I think that's where your accountability can. And I'm a local control. I'm as you know, I'm someone who advocates for local flexibility, and I think there is that accountability when you provide free people good information. And so, and again, I think you were kind of going that direction with one of your answers as well. And so I just want to say, I do think that is a strength here, that we are providing much clearer information than we've ever provided before. And then it's at least allowing local voters to say, all right, this is pretty clearly what they got. How did they do? So I didn't really intend to come in here and provide you a talking point for the bill, but I do think that's a really good selling point for it.
Commissioner, comment?
Oh, no.
Okay. Thank you. Next on the list, we have Representative Clemens. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few follow-ups to what
Yes,
was
sir.
said. With regards to transparency, you keep saying, Commissioner, that with this plan, we will know exactly how districts are spending these monies. And I don't want to get caught up in this false narrative that our only choices are the BEP or TISA, because that's not our only two options. Another option is to take our time and work through this and find one that actually a plan that solves the inherent flaws of the BP that we're not solving, as well as create a bigger pie. But couldn't we require LEAs right now? And do we not know how LEAs are spending their money?
Very nice.
So it is a federal requirement to report under ESSA how you are spending at the school and at the district level. And now it is broken up by student groups. So looking at economically disadvantaged, English learners, et cetera. That is a federal requirement either under ESSA or ESSER. Right now, because of how we do ratios and averages in the BEP, we are not able to necessarily do that at a school level. So one example, there are parts of the BEP, and while we say there are 46 components, it's divided up into well over 120 different lines when you look at how you break apart. Well, if I have 265 students, I generate this. If I have 266, I generate that. Same student goes to school A, one student difference, and now you have a different amount of funding. Similarly, you have parts of the BEP that generate funding based on single district counties, so a county that is the district, districts that have multiple systems within the county, and whether or not those multiple systems within the county generate enough funding to have, let's say, a librarian or counselor. Understanding that is very complicated and confusing, but that is our current formula. So no, in those situations where you are, in many cases, dividing the cost of the superintendent, that's one example, multi-system counties get proportional shares of that funding. So not every county is even funded for a superintendent. They get the proportional share of that funding. So it is going to be very hard to report at the school level or at the district level how much is being spent for this or that because you are pulling from different parts of the BEP. All of that to say, districts produce a budget. You can certainly look at what their budgets are, but it is not in a consistent and codified way that allows for us to report to you, here is what the spending looks like, here's what you spent money on, and here's what that looked like at the school level. We've heard that feedback overwhelmingly from our school districts now that we have this financial reporting requirement that goes on the accountability report card every year. It is very, very difficult to break apart how the funding is generated and try to apply that to different school systems. I just gave 2 examples, but I could probably come up with 50 more. And so what we have is we have a number that we can show you, but I think that the level of accuracy on that is going to be very low because we just don't have the ability to report. That's not how our formula works.
Representative Clements? Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I think the point is that we can still go to our schools and ask them how they're spending money. That nothing prohibits any of us from doing that, and nothing prohibits our schools from telling us how we spend money. So I guess that argument about transparency and what this provides.
Representative Clements, yes, she wants to give a reply to that real quick.
Sorry, I wanted to say, there's a difference, and again, and I don't want to continue to kind of, I don't mean to harp on this, but I just want to make sure I'm very, very clear. That is the difference between how money is generated and how money is spent. And so right now, yes, they can absolutely say how they spend their funding. What districts cannot do is say, here is what money was generated for these students at this school aligned to spending. But they can say, sure, for any school, here's how much money went to the school, but it doesn't necessarily align to how those funds were generated because that all happens at an aggregate level. So I just want to separate spending and funding.
Representative Clements?
Okay. I understand the difference in that. You had said that earlier. We want to know how our schools are spending this money. And anyway, maybe I misunderstood you. But I want to get back to this. What I see consistently running through this document is this false narrative that outcomes are somehow in direct correlation to how funds are spent. And I think you spoke to that a little there because there needs to be accountability. There must be transparency. I don't think this bill provides that to the extent I would like, or my taxpayers would like. But to argue that outcomes are a direct correlation to how funds are spent with regard to this stuff, getting to my colleague's question from Davidson County, and we're putting all this money into a pot, and they're going to be spending it how they want still, and yet we're going to hold them accountable and just justify that based on the fact, well, we generated it based on this number, you spent it on this number, which you can do, but now you didn't spend it how we want, and you didn't have the outcomes we want, even though you addressed, maybe they put more emphasis on CTE, they put more emphasis on disadvantaged children, but that doesn't necessarily answer all the questions and solve all the problems with regards to outcomes. And so just hypothetically, not to pick on Cheetham County, but they were here, and I think she said she was getting 4.8 million, I think, in new funds or something like that. But just to take a scenario here, you give them, let's say that you're going to increase their funding by that much. Let's say you set up a charter school in Cheetham County or any county. I'll just use Cheetham as an example. 300 kids from Ashland City, Kingston Springs Elementary, and West Cheetham Elementary go to that school. Well, we don't know what the direct allocation for charter schools is because the bill doesn't say it. I'm just going to assume, let's say 5%, because that's what you had the weight as. So that's about $343, I think, based on that based on that base amount. So if that school opens in Cheetham County, they don't get each child doesn't get a single weight, and 300 kids walk out that door at $77,203 each. $2.16 million just walked out of Cheatham County schools into a charter school with one charter school at 300 students. Now they are left with, let's say, 2.7 million of that 4.8 increase. Yet we're going to hold them accountable and expect them to cover all these things that are outlined in the base amount in the recitals. We're going to expect them to perform all these functions that you're putting in here and then hold them accountable. And if they don't, if they get a D or an F, we're going to haul them up here and institute some corrective action, send them to the ASD, whatever the board decides to do. How is that fair?
Commissioner?
That is a serious problem.
So I would say Cheatham County does not currently have charter schools. So I would say just making sure that that's clear. But I think the second thing that I would offer is that under the BEP, and maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but charter schools are allowed in state statute. So under the BEP, if a charter school were to start in any district, then the funding that is generated is applied to the charter school in the current BEP formula. So I think I'm trying to understand the what material difference in terms of TISA versus the BEP specific to charter schools. What I would say is that it is now significantly more clear and transparent exactly what that dollar amount is. Or I would actually say we have a number of districts that because of averages and ratios, it would be significantly less clear what that actual figure looks like. But the statute around public charter schools is something that is separate from this formula. So I think I might just need to understand your question a little bit better, sir.
Okay.
Clemens?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my question is, I'll start with, there is no dollar amount associated with direct allocation for a charter school. What is that direct allocation going to be?
Commissioner?
So currently, because it was moved from the weight to the direct, that happens through the appropriations each and every year. So just like CTE, the $500, we have those as placeholders. What you will see in the allocations that we had in projected allocations is we just took that same dollar amount that had been in the weights and moved that down into the direct funding. So it's the equivalent of the 4%, so that there was just a clear move.
Representative Clemens?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, the bill doesn't say 4%. It says the department shall, it'll happen through the rulemaking process. Essentially, that amount's going to be determined by subsection C there. All of those direct allocations are going to be determined in that manner. So I guess the fact that we don't know what that amount is going to be, and look, I mean, it's no secret. I mean, yes, charter schools can exist in Tennessee right now, but we know that there is a plan, or at least a hope, for 50 new ones open. They're not coming to Nashville. We're almost saturated, if not already. So they're going somewhere. So that's why I said hypothetically Cheatham County.
Commissioner, do you have a response to an earlier statement before we move on?
Just for kind of accuracy of the record, the department and the state board do not determine the appropriations. We have a rule, but those appropriations in terms of those dollar figures are determined in the budget that is then approved by the General Assembly and whatever numbers that you all come up with through the appropriations bill. So we will not come up with those numbers. That will need to be proposed, discussed, and then voted on by the General Assembly. Our rulemaking is essentially to put the number you all decide into the TISA guide. So I just want to be clear that we are not determining the number at the department. That would be, I just feel like it'd be inappropriate for us to make that decision.
Representative Clemens, you're recognized.
Thank you. But I'll make the point that we don't know. We're being asked to pass this bill, and we don't even know that amount. So we don't even know the real impact of any of these direct allocations and how they're going to play in any various county. There's just so many unknowns. That's kind of the point I'm making. But yet we're going to hold these counties accountable and just pass a bill that has all these outcome incentives that we don't know that are going to be made through rulemaking. And then we've also created a section in here for corrective action to haul these schools back in based on a letter grade. But we're not doing anything to adequately fund these schools. That's the base problem here. The 6860, everybody y'all hauled in here, Marshall County, Cheatham County, they're all excited about getting more money. But the reality is, if you look at the unknowns in this piece of legislation, with the measly amount that you're proposing to allocate per student as a base amount, there is no way it's a functional fix. And then we cannot then expect them to perform and hold them accountable with some unknown plan of action and how to hold them accountable, send them to the ASD or whatever you want to do, whatever you intend to do with them. That That is an inherent flaw in this problem, and I don't understand why we are not addressing that at this stage. We've seen no
Representative
less than,
Clemens, is there a question?
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Why isn't that addressed in this? We've had no less than 8 amendments. Why isn't any of that addressed in here?
Commissioner?
So I would start by saying I think $1 billion is a wonderful addition to current school funding. And so while I can appreciate breaking that down into just one part of a 4-part formula, it is a total of $1 billion new dollars starting in fiscal year 24. I think the other thing that I would want to offer is that currently, and I know we spoke about this in the subcommittee, there are a lot of decisions the department currently makes within the department. It's not in rule. We put a lot of rulemaking into this proposal because we believe that those decisions we are currently making internally should go through rulemaking. We think that's really important from a public transparency process. I would say that for this implementation, it's giving it 15 months. It is not something that gets implemented next year. And that's so that we can have that rulemaking so that that level of certainty is codified. And we have provided a starting place conversation where we have provided information related to CTE, to public charter schools, to the K-3 weight, the tutoring. Those dollars are in those projections, and that does signal and provide some very concrete information on what those appropriations will be. But certainly, it would not be for the department to tell the General Assembly what you choose or choose not to appropriate next year. These are for direct funding. That does come down to the decisions that you would make for the fiscal year 24 budget, and we will implement those decisions. But you do see those numbers in here based on how we have developed the projections, and certainly what we expect would be necessary to have the outcomes that we think our students deserve and that our districts have asked for.
Okay, final follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And my district's very concerned about this, obviously, and others should be as well, and I know they are. But I will just point out that there are several things in here that the department has discretion to provide with nothing more than the input of a body that you would appoint. And then the state board can only provide a positive, negative, or neutral recommendation. So I want to clarify that, but we're asking you, or at least the aim is to create a baseline teacher pay amount of $40,000 a year, which nobody's going to argue that we should be paying teachers a lot more. But right now there's 55 county systems based on the data I've seen that pay less than 40,000 as a baseline. I think Cheetham County, for instance, not to pick on Cheetham County, but it's 38,380, I think, is their baseline amount in fiscal year 21-22. Are you concerned about any of this additional funding they're getting eaten up by that part of it and not being able to spend on the other things within the bill? And this is, again, getting back to the fact that we need a bigger pie. But that's a lot of counties that are currently under that baseline amount that are going to have to raise expenses just to satisfy that requirement. And then you have it stepped up, I think, to 45,000 over the next 4 or 5 years. You're getting, again, working towards that cliff that they're going to have to cover if they follow your suggestion. And again, I don't disagree with teacher pay raises. I think we should be paying them a whole lot more than that. But with that reality, they're going to have to increase those expenses, yet cover all these other things that you're saying have to be covered and then hold them accountable.
Representative Clemens,
So
get to the question, please.
Yeah, so are you expecting those counties to spend a significant portion of their increased funding on those teacher pay raises? And if so, how do you expect them to accomplish the other things that we're going to hold them accountable for?
Your Commissioner.
Great. So I'm going to unpack a few things just to make sure we're operating under accurate information. So I think that the first thing is in the current law, when you designate additional funding for teacher salary increases, the state board is required to increase their minimum salary. So that is unchanged here. I would say second is that minimum salary is at $38,000. One of the things is with the $125 million increase proposed in Governor Lee's budget, and that certainly you all will determine if we'll go into the appropriations, that would lead to an increase to that minimum salary of $40,000. The department and the state board had that conversation over a year ago. One of the reasons that we did not do it last summer was because we were in the middle of a pandemic. We did indicate publicly that the department would recommend $40,000 as the minimum salary. That is built on the funding that you all have generously provided for educator salaries to date. In terms of keeping up, I want to be very clear because I know you've mentioned this a few times. We have an entire book of every district projection through fiscal year 30. There is literally no district in the state where in any year from fiscal year 25 to fiscal year 30, the district would be putting more in under TISA, or the locals would be putting more in under TISA than the BEP. Every district puts in more under the BEP than they do under TISA for local contribution. So if you all decide that you want to put in more money for teacher salaries, I will say proactively, thank you, very much appreciated. We'll take that anytime you want to give it. And it would require the state board to increase that minimum salary. What that ensures is it protects your investment. It says that if you put in $100 million in recurring dollars, that money doesn't just go to one-time increases for existing teachers. It raises that minimum salary to ensure that that becomes $100 million that's invested in teacher salaries every single year forevermore. It safeguards that investment for our educators and ensures that those dollars get to educator salaries. And that's what you intend. And I think it's really important that they make it there. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to make sure to clarify based on, I think, just in terms of the kind of accurate information related to the bill and the projections we've provided.
Thank you, ma'am. And next on the list, last and definitely not least, and he actually turned to me and said he'd be really quick. So all eyes are on you, Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually turned to you and was looking at you because you called on Representative Sapiki first after he had just spoken, and he was the first one to speak again. That's why I was looking at you, Mr. Chair.
Understood.
Okay, thank you.
You're recognized.
All right. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I did not mean to do that. I did not mean to do that. But it's done. Touche. Right. Right. And thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner. So,
yes, sir.
And I'm still with you in principle. I got a couple of questions though. So are there any variables in the bill? Because this question came up about variables that we don't have. I think that will be completed in rulemaking possibly. Are there any variables in the bill that would make the projections that are sent to the districts possibly less than what has been already sent to them?
Commissioner?
Clarification question. So is, just to make sure I'm understanding the question, that would decrease the funding they receive, or that would decrease their local contribution?
Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Any or all in regards to, okay, they've already received projections based on what they think is going to be allocated to the district, and I know there are still some moving parts that to this point have not been plugged in. So is there anything in those moving parts that we've been discussing that have not been plugged in that would make the allocation projections that we've sent to them already different?
Commissioner?
So these are the projections and the dollars. The only thing that is a dollar amount is in the direct funding. That is something that we have budgeted based on the funding that FNA has told us would be available for future years. So we've wanted to make sure that there was funding available. The only thing that would change those projections is if the governor proposed, the General Assembly made decisions that you all made the decision to lower it. Right now, this is what we would presume and assume is the funding, just as we do in the BEP. This is the funding that is generated in the formula. The numbers that you see here are the ones that you would see reflected next year. Of course, you're the General Assembly. You can make any changes that you want, but it would have to be something that you all decide to do. But this is what we have budgeted for.
President Parkinson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How much say does the principals or the actual school leaders have in the monies that their schools generate, that their students generate for that school, versus what is actually spent in the areas that the school needs?
Commissioner?
So the funding that is generated is going to be based on the average daily membership. So students who are enrolled in attending classes at the school. So whatever that looks like. And again, we would collect that data and report on it monthly, as opposed to, we have a few reporting periods throughout the year. So we would get that on a more regular basis. So that is how you would know how much is generated at the school. In terms of how the money is spent, that's going to vary from district to district. Some of our districts, those are fully centralized decisions. Some of our districts include principals. Many of our districts include other staff, teachers, families in their budget processes. All of our districts have to go through a public budget process. It goes to the school board. There's usually a first hearing and a second hearing before they vote. But our budgeting process typically starts actually in December, January, sometimes even earlier than that, in November, and goes through the entire spring. So it is a pretty lengthy process, but just to give you an idea of the variance across the state.
Reverend Parkinson,
Thank you,
final
Mr. Chair.
follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so, and with that, how does the accountability model intersect with that? Because, and let me tell you where I'm going with this.
Yes, sir.
If the school principal has no real say and it's all at the district level about the monies that are being spent, but yet in that letter grade of that accountability for that school, they're responsible for it. And you know, when those parents show up and say that, hey, this school generated this amount of money in these areas, and you know, we're not seeing the effect of it, and they're pointing the finger and you know, got their rakes and pitchforks out for the principal and the teachers, but yet the decisions are being made, you know, at the district level. And you know, as to add on to that, let's say there's a school in a high poverty area. Let's say there's a school in a diverse district, right, that has affluence and a little bit of poverty, and at the school in the poverty area, they're struggling with reading. But overall, that district has great reading scores, but this school in particular is struggling. And the district wants to increase their science scores. And so with the flexibility of that money, those monies, how do we guard or keep outside of the honor system? How do we ensure that the resources are being applied and not being overlooked or forsaken in that high poverty area where they're generating money for that in that school?
Commissioner, you're recognized.
I think that is exactly why a formula like this is so important, because right now let's take that example. Under the current formula, all of that happens and aggregates at the district level and then is allocated down to schools. But I, as a parent or as a teacher or that principal who's held accountable, I don't necessarily know, and it's pretty impossible. We've tried to unpack this, and Mary Ann can, of course, talk this much better than I can. You can't say this is how much money was generated at this school site, how it's generated. So as a principal, I'm held accountable, but I actually can't tell you how much money my students generated to even provide that comparison. I think that's why this is so important, is now as a principal, I can say, look, there was $1 million generated at my school. And I can say, and $700,000 was spent at my school, or 1.1 million was spent at my school. And now I'm able to have some real conversations about the money that was generated is how much what was spent at my school. And here's how I spent the money and whether or not that was effective. And it's that continual growth mindset that we have in the same way we have for academics and for our students. We want to make sure that if districts are making decisions or schools are making decisions, they get the data back. They realize this worked, we're going to keep doing it, or this didn't work, and we're going to make a change. But now we have a lot more transparency in where the funding is coming from and how those dollars were spent related to the students who were there. So I totally agree that that's a critical component of any good accountability system and any good funding system. I would like for us to be able to have that information to report back to you in a way that we cannot under the current funding formula.
President Parkinson, final follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that, Commissioner. But I want to let's look at the reality of that. You have a principal who's doing the best that she can or he can, and their staff is doing the best that they can with the allocation that they receive from their district, and even though it's in print, and so two things. One, what are we doing to make sure that parents can even understand what they're looking at and be able to articulate it in layman's terms to be able to say, hey, you're receiving this money without a bunch of tables and charts and graphs and all of this stuff that some of us don't even understand, and be able to articulate that back and create a comparison and say, hey, y'all are not providing the resources. Secondly, you know, we've been having a lot of discussion about DNA and birth certificates. How does a person that's told he's the father ask a woman who just had a baby I want a DNA test? How does that principal say, hey, the superintendent is not putting the money into this school without facing the ire of the superintendent or his henchman or her henchman. And so how do we make that something that can actually be done without creating that tension between, because that principal and those teachers are sitting between the superintendent, this representative right here that I'm not going to call his name, and yourself and the parents on the other side. How do we do that?
Commissioner, you recognize?
Yes, sir. So I think that is part of the accountability report card. So part of the federal requirement is that we report on that. And so we wouldn't, and I think it's a fair point. If you're the principal, you don't want to really call out your superintendent. And so what happens is that from the department's perspective, we report on that. So we say, this is how much funding was generated for this school. This is how much was spent on that school. And it actually goes on the public accountability report card. So we are able to say, this is how much money the kids in this school were supposed to receive in terms of spending and supports based on what they generated. Here's how much the school actually spent on those children for the funds that they generated. So we actually do that publicly and transparently reported. Now, in terms of accountability on, hey, you didn't do that, right? Right. Then there is an outlet for that. In the House version, that is coming to an ad hoc committee if that is the will of that particular of the General Assembly.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Chairman Sapiki, your name was mentioned. You have a brief comment?
I'll be very brief. So the department has been working on this since last summer with all the committees, with all of the people that have provided information here. I don't know the exact date that the committee got it, maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago. This bill has gone through numerous rewrites. Last week, the committee added 3 amendments. I know there's probably 6 more amendments that want to go on the bill today. If we get to a point that we move this forward and we pass this and we send this out, because it's going to be law now, and the superintendents and the county commissioners and everybody else goes, uh-oh, we missed something here. I assume we're going to have enough time to come back next January and fix whatever's wrong before it goes into implementation in 23-24, correct?
Commissioner?
One of the best practices is that you provide significant time before implementation. We've seen lots of states who have been able to provide that for professional development, any adjustments that the General Assembly might want to make. So yes, sir, you would have that opportunity next session.
Okay, so we could wait on the whole thing.
Commissioner?
No, because what happens is the funding that starts next year, all of that data from next year informs the following year. We fund on the prior year.
Right.
So starting August 1st, that data that's collected. So if you were to make a meaningful change, let's say on the formula, and I want to be clear, nothing really on the formula has changed. It's been a lot of the support. The big change has been moving the charter to direct and increasing funding for tutoring. But the actual formula has not shifted in the amendments. It's been a lot of the language around it and who's on committees and things and really important policy decisions. But it would be not considered a best practice in terms of changing the goalpost on districts in terms of what data you are going to use in a formula, because they make decisions based on that data. What I would say is that if you wanted to make adjustments, certainly that increased, that would be something that we've seen, or if you wanted to make adjustments related to who sits on committees and some of the amendments that we've seen here. But it is about implementation so that you have professional development, enough time for budgeting, helping people understand change.
One follow-up.
Quick follow-up.
So just to clarify, what your statement just said is if we pass this year and there's a catastrophic problem, you're saying that we can't fix that in January and still implement it in time in the 23-24 school year?
Commissioner?
I think what I'm saying is that I think that there are 2 different examples that you provided. One is, can you make changes to a funding formula next session? Yes, you can do that any session. You could do that to the BEP. So that is yes, you can do that. I think in terms of, is it advisable to make a shift, a meaningful shift in how school districts are funded 3 to 6 months before they actually receive those funding? That is not considered a best practice. I would say we have projected things out to fiscal year 30. If there was something quote unquote catastrophic, that would be something for the General Assembly to consider. I don't see anything that would forecast that would happen, but that is always the will of the General Assembly if you wanted to make a change to any part of the statute, of course. So that would be my answer to that.
Thank you, members. Great discussion here. I would ask our guests to stay just in case questions are needed as we move forward. With that, we're going to go back in session. Chairman White, you are recognized for any comments before we move forward to address these amendments we have in front of us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. Great discussion. Thank you, Commissioner and Department. Let me just point this out as we move forward, just food for thought. These are great questions that we've had, but these are the same questions we've been asking. Like I say, I've been on the Education Committee for 9 years. We've been asking these same questions for the 9 years. I know probably long before that. Why are high school graduations rates not where they should be? Why is 4th and 8th grade math and science and reading scores on the NAEP scores not better? Why is our 3rd grade reading not better? We're asking these same questions. And so whether it's the BEP or a system like this, which I have spent a lot of time studying, which I think will give us more accountability, as the commissioner said, then I think that is something we need to consider also. Ask the same questions, ask your head if we're on the same system that we are now. Are any of those questions answered under the current BEP? One last thing, just to point out, it seems like there was a little bit of hesitation, and I've been thinking through this too. We're concerned moving forward. I mean, aren't we fortunate as a state, we can talk about adding $1 billion to education. Now, we could just put in a rainy day fund, forget about it, or some other department if we wanted to, but this state is very focused on improving education. But we're going to want to put $1 billion into education under this formula moving forward. So we're concerned, like, what about next year if we want to put another 100 million and we really want it to go to teacher salaries, or well, think about Tennessee growing. You know, we've got Ford plant coming. We're talking about investing possibly 500 million in an NFL stadium in the city, bringing more tourism in. We've got Oracle. We've got growth, industrial growth in the state. I would hope maybe in 5 years our education budget is up to 12 billion instead of 9 billion, 15 billion in education. So we're concerned about possibly putting more money in, but then again, you say, well, the percentage of the weights go up too, and say in a unique learning needs student too, that district's doing okay. Well, it's our decision as General Assembly if we're going to put more money into education. We don't have to put another dime in. If we don't think of schools, if we think we've reached nirvana in education at some point, then we don't have to put any more money in. But if you put another 100 million in next year, and you do a lot of wanting to go to teacher salaries, but so the weights do increase, we're putting more money in education. That is our decision. And our schools will have, one thing I really like about this, our schools, our leadership, this is going to require tremendously great leadership on the local level. They will be getting the money, and they have the flexibility to make their district shine. And those that lead well, they're going to shine, and those that don't, they're going to be left behind, and this could be very noticeable. So I think that's where a lot of accountability comes in too. So I think we need to keep all these things in mind. We have an opportunity to look at something that has so many positives in it, because we're going to continue to add money in education in Tennessee. And so with that, I'll stop right there and we'll move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, we have a couple of handfuls of amendments here that we're going to start looking into. And the first one is by Chairman Haston. Chairman Haston, you are recognized, and give us that amendment number to make sure we're all on the same page.
Drafting code 16571.
That's it. Members have a motion and a second on this amendment? Properly motioned, second. Chairman Haston, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, actually, Chairman Hurt and I had a number of directors and school health coordinators contact our offices, noting a technical correction that probably needed to be made, and we worked with the department on this language. And what the technical correction does in the amendment is it returns program language regarding who will serve as the coordinator, and also the listing of how an LEA addresses the health needs of school children. And that's what the amendment does. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, any question on this amendment? Any questions? Chairman White, you're recognized.
Just wanted to tell the committee I've talked to Chairman Haston on this, and this looks like a good amendment that I would be willing to entertain for this particular legislation.
Thank you, Chairman White. Any other members? Question's been called. Without objection, we'll be voting on Amendment 16571. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it. Amendment goes on. Next, members, we will recognize Chairman Sapiki. You have an amendment also. You recognize, Chairman. Looks like the next one down the list is maybe 16572. Is that what you're showing?
16572.
Motion on the amendment. Motion second on the amendment. Properly motion seconded. Chairman Sapiki, you are recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, members. This is kind of just signaling. It's not requiring anything, but it's signaling that one of the bills that we get all the time is our ratios for our nurses and our school counselors and our RTI interventionists. It's not requiring them to do this. It's just signaling about the intention of the funding of the bill. One full-time public school nurse position for each 750 students. One full-time public school counselor position for each 250 students. And one full-time response to instruction intervention position for each 500 students. That's what it does. It just kind of signals to them of what the intent of, so that we don't keep getting bills every year of reducing the numbers. We're reducing them here right now. That's all.
Thank you, Chairman. Any discussion on this amendment? Representative Cochran, you are recognized.
Thank you. Just one quick question to the sponsor of the amendment. These ratios, are these the numbers that this new formula is based on already, or are these new numbers? And maybe I should direct that question somewhere else, but you may know that, sponsor.
Chairman.
These are the numbers that we were given from the department of what the best practices would be.
Good. Thank you. Any other members want to be recognized on this amendment? Representative Clemens, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I seem to recall one of the original presentations of this bill in its original form had some reference to these ratios, did it not?
Chairman, speaking.
I don't believe so, no.
Okay.
There was another amendment that was going to be filed, but never was.
Okay.
Representative Clemens.
Yeah, there's been so many versions I can't keep up. I apologize.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Chairman White, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. And Chairman Sapiki has about 3 amendments, and you got a couple good ones. This is one I'd kind of like to encourage us to stay away from, just because it does kind of put us back into this ratio-based formula that we're in the BEP. And that's what's given us problems under the BEP, is when you set ratios, and I know it's just encouraging, and I think there's enough flexibility where the administrations will do this anyway, as the commissioner as well pointed out. But one of the most frustrating things sitting in committee when we're operating off a system of ratios, you know, let's take the nurses. We fund 1 nurse per 3,000 students. For years, we've been wanting to go to 1 nurse for 750. Well, then we have a bill before us. It's got a $40 million fiscal note to do so. So we're right back, and the districts are saying, well, the reason we don't have enough is because you're not funding the ratio. So I would encourage us to stay away and let this particular formula, which I think addresses it, stay away of anything that brings us back into a resource-based formula and puts ratios back in the system, in the formula.
Thank you, Chairman Wright. Representative Clemens, you have a question for the sponsor of the amendment?
Well, yes. So I'll ask sponsor the amendment. So you're familiar that the base amount recitals in the bill expressly state that we're to provide counselors, nurses, and address the RTI requirements that exist under state law already. You are familiar with that, and I assume that's why you want these ratios in there, to encourage them to follow these recommendations and percentages, because the bill didn't provide otherwise.
Chairman.
That's precisely right. If we don't, how are we going to penalize them for not doing something we're not encouraging them to do? If we're going to run a bill and mysteriously not tell them what our nurses' ratios are, they're operating off existing practices. And so all this does is just kind of signal to them, they still have the flexibility. They can do this or not. They can do whatever they want. But by putting this in the bill, it at least signals to them is, if we say, hey, you have issues with RTI, and your ratios are 1 to 1,200, why didn't you fund more RTI students that we provided funding for? It's just to give some clarifying language to them, because if not, I don't know how they're going to know to do this unless we signal to them to do it. That's all.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions on this amendment?
Question on the amendment.
Question's been called without objection. We'll be voting on amendment 16572. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes have it. Amendment goes on the bill. Next in line, we have Chairman Sapiki. Looks like 165.
It's 016573.
That's what we have. Motion second on the amendment. Motion second on the amendment. Chairman Sapiki, you are recognized.
Thank you, members. This is an amendment that what it does is it allows us to reward teachers that are performing at highest levels with a performance bonus. It's subject to available funds. It would be swept out of the outcomes funds that are swept into the department that aren't realized. And it's just a way for us to reward our teachers that are performing at a high level.
Thank you for that explanation. Members, any questions? Members, I'd like to take a second here in reading this amendment and looking at it, and we have our guests at the table in front of us. I'd like to go out of session to ask our guest a quick question. We are out of session. Department, when looking at the funds that could possibly be available, do y'all, do you know what kind of funding might be available in order to accomplish this?
Thank you, sir. So two points. So one is any funding that is not used for whatever the outcomes committee determines would be funded. So right now, the proposals that you have third grade TCAP proficiency, you have ACT scores of 21, and you have earning a tier 2 or tier 3 industry credential plus post high school. If after any student who qualifies, who generates that outcomes funding, any funding that is remaining from that pot could be used, but until we actually have the students each and every year, it would be a variable amount. Right now, our budget is based on what we have projected those outcomes to be in the first year of implementation. And so that is what we've backwards mapped into it. So it would be a relatively small pot based on what the current outcomes proposal is that certainly that committee would look at.
Okay, thank you. Chairman Reagan, question for our guest.
Thank you. Is there any problem with this proposal from the standpoint of, regardless of how small it is, it still provides an incentive? Is there any problem with providing that incentive?
Commissioner?
No, sir. And districts, and to be clear, districts can, with the outcomes funding that is generated currently, they could use the dollars for teacher bonuses as well. So it is, there is no issue with that at all.
Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we'll be going back in session. Okay, members, back on amendment 16573. Representative Parkinson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you know, on this amendment, I'm just wondering if this amendment would be better served for those teachers that choose to serve in you know, lower performing schools, and you know, and which would, you know, because I know we all want to be number one, and so if there was, you know, an opportunity, or if this amendment would be considered for amending, you know, to focus this as an incentive to get our best teachers into our lower performing schools, that might be a better way of serving through this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chairman Sapiki, comment?
That's a great comment. And the reason why the bill was written was that so that in our large metropolitan cities, that teachers that are performing at level 4 or 5 on growth would be able to take advantage of this bonus. So this isn't linked. This is their overall effectiveness. That's what it is. And so basically it opens it up to every teacher in the entire state that's moving our students forward at the above or significantly above expectations.
Thank you. Representative Clemens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, sponsor, for answering my colleague's question. I guess my concern is, and I've expressed these concerns with regard to the outcome incentives that we don't even know what they are yet, and they're subject to available appropriations, obviously. My concern is, that a lot of the challenges our teachers are facing happen outside the classroom in the community. And I feel like we're disproportionately rewarding teachers who teach in areas of high socioeconomic standing or in areas that are sometimes more conducive to high performance in the classroom, because we know everything that happens outside that school gets brought into that school. So I guess my concern is, and could you address my concern, that this would disproportionately reward teachers in more affluent communities and potentially?
Chairman Sapiki.
Another great question. I think what this would do is level the playing field across the state of Tennessee, where a student that would be teaching in Germantown that has high proficiency levels, you get a teacher teaching in Davidson or one of our major metropolitan cities, they could still attain this bonus by their growth scores. And right now in Davidson County, we have probably some of the greatest growth in the whole state of Tennessee. These teachers should be able to take part. If they're taking a student that's 2 years behind and they're getting them back up to grade level, they should be rewarded for that. Even though that student may not test proficient, they're still able to attain this bonus because of the growth that they're doing for those students. So it should level the playing field across the state.
Thank you, sir. Members, any other questions for the amendment sponsor? Chairman White, you're recognized.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. Want us to consider this, as the commissioner just said, these are limited dollars. This is what's left over that we can do for bonuses and things of that nature. Like even at this point, we don't know how much that will be. If we take away if we dictate and take away the flexibility for the local districts to use it how they best see fit for their district, and say it all goes to one area, then there's another area that we're also interested in. What about we're wanting the districts to bring up their third grade reading scores? That is one outcome that could be funded through the state, that if you are a district that has more students reading on grade level by the end of third grade. But if we dictate how these funds are going to go, then we kind of take away those opportunities too. So I would think that they already have the flexibility to use the dollars just as the chairman says, but let's don't dictate that. Let's let them get the opportunity to use it for a multitude of reasons. And for that, I would prefer we not add this amendment onto the bill.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Sapiki, any final comments on your amendment before we take a vote?
Yeah, I think that's precisely why we have to add it in, is because we are trying to give salary increases to our teachers, and we get to complain all the time that they don't wind up with our teachers. This is a way for us that if we have available funds, that the outcomes committee can allocate those funds directly to teacher bonuses who are performing at the highest level. So we at least have some opportunity of available funds to get these bonuses to the teachers. So that's all.
Thank you, Chairman. Members, Representative Chairman Lafferty, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that I've already heard in the discussion that the teachers are going to be looking for, or are going to be getting a pay raise through this process. Is that correct? It's when all of if this passes on through, there is going to be some pay raise out there for the teacher of some sort.
That is correct.
Okay. The reason that I wanted to clarify that, I feel like we're getting now the cart way out in front of the horse with already talking about bonuses down the road for something that we've not even implemented here in the present and gotten those first pay raises in place to begin with. Just wanted to bring that to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Representative Cochran, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. And to the amendment sponsor, again, just kind of a question of how this would work in practicality. How do you envision, so there would be these leftover funds, how would it then be distributed to those above expectation teachers and those who score above expectations and significantly above expectations? Are the leftover funds from the state equally divided to the districts, and then the districts give them to those? Like, how does that flow work if this amendment were to be attached to it?
Chairman Sapiki, you recognize?
Well, in theory, once the Department of Education knows who our level 4 or 5 teachers are, they could do it could do a direct payment down to the district with those teachers already identified to distribute to them, or we could do a straight bonus plan from the state. And what would happen is the rule, government operations would promulgate those rules on how they want to do it.
Representative
Okay.
Cochran, follow up.
I think that answers that. Thank you.
Members, without objection, we'll be voting on Amendment 16573. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Noes have it. Amendment fails.
Roll call vote. Too late. Never mind.
Sorry, too late, Chairman. All right. Next, moving right down the list, we will be on back to Chairman Sapiki for his final amendment there. What number are you showing, Chairman Sapiki?
16574.
Amendment, the same number we have, 16574. A motion and a second on the amendment?
Motion.
Motion and a second. Chairman, you are recognized.
This is by far the most controversial amendment I've ever written in my entire life. And I'm sure Chairman White will absolutely hate it like he does every one of my amendments I make. And I know, what? No. And I know he's getting direction, and I understand that. That's fine. And I know the department is opposing most of these, and that's fine. I know the governor's opposing most of these. That's fine. So what the amendment does is it's very complicated, but what it does is in the committee that's going to be established, there was in the language that it said 3 directors of schools, and that was it. Or it said a director of school. And what this amendment does is it breaks it out to 3 directors of schools would be appointed to this committee. And it's one from an urban, one from a suburban, and one from a rural to be able to give the nuances of each one of those districts. And that's all it does, add those 3 members.
Hold on. Thank you, Chairman, for that explanation. Members, any questions on Amendment 16574? Chairman White, you're recognized.
As a free thinker, it gives me great pleasure to endorse this amendment.
All right.
Question on the amendment.
Question has been called. Members will be voting on Amendment 16574. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes have it. Amendment goes on. Moving right ahead. Let me see which one we got next. 16290. We have Representative Love, you're recognizing your amendment. What number are you showing?
I have amendment number 16290, Mr. Chairman.
That's what we're showing. Motion and second on Amendment 16290. Representative Love, you are recognized for explanation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as many people know, the ratios for school districts vary across the state, from the state contributions to the LAA's match. And my district is one of those that has a almost opposite effect, where I think present day Davidson County's contribution is somewhere around 62, 63%, and the state contribution is around 37, 38%. And so, not to hurt other school districts, but I think it's just as we start to think about how the state's changing and how fiscal capacity is going to be changing across the state, we may consider looking at this amendment, which says, notwithstanding subdivision A1, each LEA shall receive no less than 50% of the average of the state allocations made pursuant to subdivision A1. So it sets a floor to say that the state contribution can't go lower than 50%. With that, Mr. Chairman, that's the summation of the amendment.
Thank you for that explanation. Members, any questions on Amendment 16290 for the sponsor? Any questions or comment? Chairman White, you're recognized.
Okay, and if the commissioner wants to respond to it, I'll defer to that also. Here's my thoughts on this particular one. I understand what you're asking, but you're asking to put this into the formula. Now, there's 2 ways. If we put the 50% base, as you're talking about, into the formula, then number one, it's got to come from everybody else, the other 94 counties. But that's not what necessarily we're asking for, or the state could put it in. If the state puts it in, as the fiscal capacity of any county, whether it be Davidson, Sevier, Shelby, or any county, as the fiscal capacity grows, and look at the fiscal capacity in Nashville. Say we do get this NFL stadium. Say when Oracle comes in, and on and on, the fiscal capacity of Nashville continues to grow. Therefore, in the years to come, that 50% base in the state increases. It's more and more every year because of the fiscal capacity of these different counties. So I think it's dangerous at this point. I think we're kind of getting the cart before the horse to put this in the legislation at this time. If we want to talk about direct funding, as we did with the charters, we took the charters out and put them in direct funding. I would be willing to have that discussion, but to put this into the formula, the TISA formula, I think it's a little dangerous right now because we don't know where we're going with the fiscal capacity of different counties.
Thank you, Chairman White. And you mentioned the department. Let's go out of session and get thoughts from the department with that. We are out of session. Commissioner, you are recognized.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to turn it over to Sam Piercy, who drafted the fiscal note on this particular amendment.
You're recognized.
Thank you, everyone. So just a point of clarification, with the way the language currently reads of the 50% of the average of state allocations, the way that math will work is that it will actually look at the state allocations made to every single district, average those, pull up 50% of it, and then anyone who falls under that would get those additional dollars. So just to clarify that would affect about almost 70 districts statewide. I just want to make sure that was clarified on this. Oh, sorry, for a total fiscal note of $679 million.
Thank you. Members, any other questions while we're out of session for the department? Chairman Lafferty, you're recognized.
Just clarity for me. I understood earlier that we were roughly, not concretely, but roughly 70-30 state to local across the state. I'm not sure I see how that's not true. Let me reconsider my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Representative Love, you are recognized.
I'll wait till we get out of session. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, we are out of session, Representative Love.
I'm sorry, wait till we get back in session. I'm sorry.
Gotcha. Representative Parkinson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what is the state to local ratio across the state?
Department.
So in the proposed TISA model, it looks like the average local contribution will be almost 21%.
Representative Parkinson.
And so if the average local is 21%, local contribution is 21%, that would mean that the average state contribution would be what, 79? Somewhere, if I'm doing my math right. And so how does putting a floor of 50% not work?
Department, you recognized.
So I think just to walk through this math part, it's about where the floor ends up being applied. And I think you've got two things going on here. If you look at where the floor is applied with the way the amendment is proposed right now, it looks at that average rate and it's going to bring everyone up to 50% of the average. That's why it's impacting so many districts at such a high dollar figure. I think to the chairman's point earlier, part of the challenge is that this amount will always grow. As we invest more money in schools, if that is the will of the General Assembly in future years, and as student count across the state grows, the local share will also grow, therefore that gap up will also grow. So you've got an indeterminate amount that will go up every single year.
President Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm just trying to, wrap my mind around it. It's been a long day. And so let me ask this, is it in the language of the amendment that's not properly stated to reach the goal that he's trying to reach? And what does that language need to say?
Department, you're recognized.
So I will be answering that. So if let me make sure I understand the intent. The intent is to ensure that those districts that currently contribute more than 50%, that they are establish a floor for those couple of districts. So then I think you would want it to reflect it that clearly and just say any district whose local contribution is more than 50% will establish a floor of 50%, or the state shall establish a 50% floor. It would just be the kind of that one sentence.
Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mrs. Claire. And I think we understand the intent of, just not yet, if my intent is right. Okay, I think we understand the actual intent of where the good Reverend Doctor is trying to go with this amendment. And I didn't want us to get lawyered on technical jargon, right? And so if we understand that that's his intent, Mr. Chair, is this something that we can fix in language here to be straightforward about a floor of 50% and get the amendment either voted up or down in the right and actual posture?
Let me check.
Thank you, sir. I'm here for you. I just want you to know.
Members,
I
I've
do, but I
received
think
advice
it
on
needs
this.
to be
That's
done outside.
back in order.
I've done this for me.
Chairman White,
Were
recognized.
you getting ready to respond to legal? I'm sorry. I'll speak after that if you
Okay.
are.
What I've been told is this is a substantial verbal amendment, which would drastically affect, and we don't do that in full committee. So that's what I've been told. Chairman White, you recognized?
Thank you very much. And even at that point, I would still caution the committee to go in that direction, the formula. If we're just talking about one county, as the fiscal capacity of that county continues to grow, then the state is on the hook for more and more money as the years go by. I think it'd be a better conversation if that's what we want to get at, is to look at a direct funding model and not put this amendment into the TISA formula.
Representative Love?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to take everybody's word in good faith. We'll work on this, all right? Because my intention is not to hurt any of the counties. But I do think that one has to take in consideration, yes, as much as Davidson County's fiscal capacity increases, we make assumptions that because you have capacity, you have money left over. It's just like assuming that someone makes a certain amount of money that they have disposable income when they have bills due. And so, yes, we got stadium money, but we got stadium bonds. Yes, we got arena money, but we got arena bonds, and we got infrastructure. And so we have capacity, but we also have bills we got to pay. And accountability. So I don't want to hurt other counties because that's not fair. So I know I got actually some place to go at 6:30 called Lee Chapel for Bible studies I got to conduct.
Okay,
So
members, do we have any more? We are still out of session. Do we have any more questions for the department? We'll go back in session in order to move forward. Without objection, we are back in session. We have, what was your intention with that statement, with your amendment? Okay, motion to withdraw the amendment. Without objection, amendment is withdrawn. Moving forward, the final amendment in front of us today is Chairman Reagan. You are recognized. Can you give us a amendment number, please, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to have to ask for consideration of an untimely filed amendment because the one before you left out 3 important words. They would be substantive changes. This untimely filed amendment makes that correction. So I would ask for a motion to consider untimely amendment.
Motion and second to consider. Members, we will be voting on. Do you have a draft code for an untimely filed amendment?
I do, sir. The drafting code is 16816.
16816. Members, we will be voting on, without objection, we'll be voting on hearing an untimely filed amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes have it. I need a motion and a second on the amendment. Chairman Reagan, you are recognized on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. We've been asking for accountability, and I bring before you an amendment that has some accountability in it. The amendment that is in front of you is a little bit complex, so I've asked to have passed out to you a PowerPoint presentation. I will go through the PowerPoint presentation, which explains the bill, and then I'll go back and make sure we got that squared away. The journey to number one here is based upon the fact that currently the school districts in our nation that are ranked number one in terms of third grade literacy, and in keeping with the intent of the bill before us, this is aimed at third grade literacy. Eventually, I hope to make it to eighth grade literacy. But with this plan, every district will be held to a 15% growth standard over the course of 3 years. But I need to point out to you, it's not a straight 15%. It's 15% of a gap. And I'll come back to that with greater explanation in just a minute. On the next slide, if you look, the incentive, that is the idea that we're going to reward districts for meeting this goal, is their autonomy of spending remains unchanged. In other words, if they're hitting their goals, the state's not going to come in and stir their pot for them. The money is given to the districts just as it always is at the beginning of the cycle. And if the goal is met, they will not be reassessed until the next cycle. The cycle is 3 years long. If the outcome is not reached, a district will qualify in what the bill calls an opportunity district, and a progress review board, which is defined in this bill rather, as the Commissioner of Education, the Chair of the State Board of Education, 2 members appointed by the Speaker of the Senate, and 2 members appointed by the Speaker of the House. This progress review board would then step in offering support. The support could be recommendations for additional training, changes in curriculum material, any number of things that this board sees as an opportunity to help this opportunity district. On the next slide, you have a big circle that says different districts have different challenges. And this is where the 15% of growth measure over 3 years is, it says to help soften the impact of differences. You'll notice that there's an example given there of District A, which is not doing too well. They only have a 20% third grade reading literacy rate. District B is doing better with 40%. By the way, these numbers are theoretical. District C is doing really well at 60%. So what this bill proposes, if you look at the next slide, is a bar graph, is that District A, to hit the goal of 70%, has to improve by 50% of that, 20 from 70, so they've got a 50% improvement requirement. However, 15% of that would be 7.5% of the total. District B has an opportunity for 30% growth overall, but 15% of that would be 7.5%. I'm sorry, 4.5%. And District C, which is doing well already, couldn't get 15% if they tried. There's only 10% left for them to get. But the difference, 15% of the difference, is 1.5%. The idea behind this is that it doesn't punish any district for failing to achieve it because it's based on the differences. Over time, this board that we talked about will 3 years of assessment there will reassess that and move. If they make progress, they'll move the floor up, which will decrease the amount of improvement they have to make at each cycle. But eventually, they'll close that gap all the way to make Tennessee number one in the nation on third grade literacy. I realize that this has been very, very brief and perhaps somewhat confusing. I want to point out to you that the change that was made between the originally filed amendment and this one is on subparagraph C1, and there was a phrase left out of the original bill, which was talking about 15% of the gap. That was why the untimely amendment was necessary. Mr. Chair, committee, I stand ready to answer questions, and I apologize for being a numbers geek. I may have been able to explain that better, but in the interest of time, I rushed through it. Please ask questions.
Thank you, Chairman Reagan. Representative Cochran, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Reagan. And so let me talk through a scenario, and then maybe you can explain it to me. So as I've heard you explain the amendment, could you be in a situation where, as you mentioned earlier, where you have a school district at 60% proficiency, which right now in our state would be pretty phenomenal, that maybe doesn't get that 1.5% in the 3 years, right? And so that triggers, let's just call it the negative effect of I'm assuming that would be more training. Is that, tell me kind of tell me what the stick is if they don't reach that 15% of the gap. And then I'm going to ask a quick follow-up if that's okay.
All right.
Chairman
this,
Reagan?
This particular situation you've highlighted, this board that is outlined here would assess with the district what their problems were potentially, and then make recommendations to them. It may be additional training, it may be a curriculum change, any number of things that this board comes up with to suggest. And oh, by the way, when suggestions are agreed to by the district, then they have to spend the money that requires. That's the stick. They lose some of their spending autonomy. Now they can still spend the rest of the money as they choose, but the money that this board can get the district to agree to spend on changing this particular problem is where they've lost their autonomy, and that is the stick.
Follow up, Representative Cochran.
Thank you very much. And so I guess my worry would be you could have a situation where you have a district that is doing a really good job. Again, if you have one in the 60s right now, all of us would consider that phenomenal. And so if they don't raise their scores by 1.5%, they literally would have less autonomy than maybe a school district that's only achieving 25% or 33% proficiency, but they had a 15% growth in their gap. They closed their gap by 15%, but they could still be at a very low overall proficiency rate. So they kind of keep some autonomy and some spending autonomy while you have very high achieving districts who don't keep that same autonomy because they weren't, maybe they weren't able to close that gap as much. That's my main concern, is that you actually could have really good districts that are doing things correctly, and then because they didn't get that 15%, suddenly the state steps in and maybe we do something that stops that progress. That's my main concern.
Jim Reagan.
Okay, if I can address that, this board does not take over the spending. They're making recommendations on the training and stuff that this district you're talking about needs to spend upon and obligate that district to spending on it. And my point to you, sir, would be this: I don't care how good they're doing. If they're not hitting the goal, they're not hitting the goal. And so to make our state number one, we need to have everybody improving. Now, the amount that each district has to improve is depending on how well they're doing. The better they're doing, the smaller total amount they have to improve. That's a recognition of the fact that the closer you get to the top, the more effort and time, money it takes to get that last little bit of increment. But again, the idea is that without that stick of making this board come in and say to them, what is it you're not doing that you think you could be doing? And we recommend this based on best practices. So the idea is that even if they're doing well, if they're not hitting the goal, there's more room to improve, and they need the help.
Representative Cochran.
And one last follow-up. Thank you for the indulgence. And so let's say that high achieving district, they don't get the 1.5% growth, and the state comes in with recommendations. Does that district have the option to say, hey, we don't like your recommendations. We don't think your recommendations are going to work any better. We've been achieving better than anyone else in the state. Does that district have the option to tell the state, no, we're not going to accept that? Or do they have to accept the state's recommendations? And then, as you mentioned earlier, when they accept those, they have to spend the money that way. So I guess first question, and the main one, do they have to accept the state's best practices if they didn't meet that 15%?
The straightforward answer, thank you. The straightforward answer to your question is it's going to be based on an agreement between the board and the district, but the straightforward answer to it is going to be yes, because they're not hitting the goal. They're doing good. Not the intent here, because of their performance, is not to penalize them, but they're still not hitting the goal. Those that are moving in accordance with their percentage of required improvement are hitting the goal. So we'll let them keep their autonomy. But the minute they cease to hit the goal, they get the same treatment as the example you just brought up.
Thank you. Representative Keem, you have a question for the department. With that, we'll go out of session. Representative Keem, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, do you or your department have a perspective on the recommendation that's being made at this time?
Commissioner?
So thank you for the question, sir. We have worked with the chairman on the language related to this, based on, I think, what his intent was here. The only thing that I would clarify is in the current language, it does require I'm just going to read the actual language, and that way you can tell me if I'm wrong, sir. It does require the LEA to complete the training, but there isn't a kind of requirement in terms of spending of funds. And so I would just want to make sure for district clarification, that's currently what the language says. But we did we did have a preview of the amendment.
Thank you very much. Chairman.
Representative King, you're recognized.
Yeah. Would I be able to ask Chairman White the same question?
We'll have to need to go back in
Go back
session.
in
So that, do you
session.
have any more questions
No, sir.
for?
No, sir.
Okay. Members, we're back in session. Representative King, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman White, would you give me a perspective on this?
And thank you.
Chairman White.
Thank you. Yeah, as I looked at this amendment at first, we do have an accountability piece already in place. Now, I have no issue with Chairman Reagan's proposal, additional accountability. It doesn't hurt. The only, according to his amendment, there's no other action other than additional training, if I'm correct on that, Chairman Reagan specified. So I do not have an issue if this amendment does go on. It's additional accountability. We can see, but we do have accountability already, but I have no problem with this particular amendment.
Representative Lafferty, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your comments about the accountability part. My mind goes to, first, the higher performing schools. When I first ran, one of the things that I heard from teachers was just give us a stable platform. Quit messing with things. I could imagine the frustration of a high performing school coming up very short, or a low performing school making great progress, but yet coming up just a little short. And if that happens over a series of years, I could imagine the frustration of those administrators being, you know what, I'm done. I'm out of here. I've been giving this all I got for 2 or 3 years. I keep getting my chops busted no matter what I do. I'm out of here. I don't want to run those folks off. Not saying that that's an absolute, certainly just hypothetical, but I think very easily a jump that can be made to an outcome to this. Thank you.
Chairman Reagan, response?
Thank you. Let me clarify. I mentioned it but didn't hit on it. This is a 3-year period. So they can have annual ups and downs. It's the 3-year number that counts. So if they're, assuming a linear progression, they'd get the 5% per year, which would add up to 15. But 1 year, maybe they get 7.5. The next year they get 6 or 4. But the point is that the linear trend, as long as it gets to the end, they're where they need to be. So the idea of variation in there was taken into account with a 3-year period. Everybody knows, and you've heard this the saying from year to year, this class is really great and this class is not, kind of thing. By going over 3 years, that averages out. And I think that would address your concern there. If they're frustrated over a 3-year period, they're still not doing something right. And again, this bill is intended, as Chairman White pointed out, to have an absolute standard of accountability. Tennessee will be number 1 if we hit that goal. So things are not changing over time. What they call the AMOs, that changes year to year. This is not going to change. And frankly, we don't have to hit 70, I'll be honest. If we get 68, we're still going to be number 1. But the point I'm getting to is there's an absolute number that you look at that is your goal. It doesn't change over time. And it is something that everybody can shoot for.
Thank you. Next on the list, we have Representative Parkinson for the amendment sponsor.
Yeah, sure. I just think that, and I just got more of a statement than a question, that I just think that this just adds an already overloaded bureaucratic piece of legislation that's more bureaucracy to it. And if we already got accountability measures in, let's just try to get to hearing the bill so we can get on with whatever it is, state business we got to get on in regards to this, to our education funding. It's already overloaded. So thank you, sir.
Chairman Reagan, response?
I would respond that we're already collecting the data. This data is already in the department's hands. This just requires them to reanalyze it in a different fashion. So it's not adding bureaucracy. It's already collected.
Thank you. And last on the list is Chairman Haston. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing the amendment. I think it is good to have some goals and targets associated with this, so I appreciate that. I will just note some of the language in the bill here that I think might alleviate some of the concerns earlier. It says here, if the board determines further action is necessary, then the board shall recommend that the Commissioner of Education require the LEA to complete training in addition to the requirements. So there you have, the board is going to take into consideration if it's a higher level, higher performing, and they got 1.4%, I would say the board might just say, you're doing well. We're not going to recommend anything to the commissioner. If the recommendation is made, the commissioner still would have the ability to look at it and recommend either, a lesser amount of training or say, no, we think in this site. My point is there's some exit ramps along the way to protect those higher performing schools. But I do think that this could be a good vehicle to be able to share best practices, professional training along the way, which is one of the things I do appreciate. So I appreciate the amendment, and I'll be supporting it.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Reagan, any final comments, follow up?
That was the best summary I could have made. I ask for your support.
Okay, members, without objection, we'll be voting on amendment number 16816. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it. Amendment goes on. All right, members, that brings us to the final, through all the amendments. Chairman White, you are recognized for any final comments.
Thank you, committee, and thank you all for giving 3+ hours to this. What I will end on at this point, and the bill is at the will of the committee at this point. We did spend the last 3 weeks in subcommittee getting a good foundation. We looked at 6 different amendments today to kind of address. Some were added, some were not. I feel very, very good about this particular one. Like I say, the 9 years I've served in the Education Committee, the BEP formula from 30 years ago that was created during a time whenever the small school district, sued the state because it wasn't, I think that's right, enough funding. So we pushed it. We're at an opportune time now. People have told me, no, well, let's put it off next year or maybe next year. Well, we've got an election between now and next year. There's not a guarantee all of us will be back. There's not a guarantee that the $1 billion will be there. There's not a guarantee on a lot of things. I think the administration, the department, and even all of us have put a lot of time and effort in this, and I feel very comfortable with it. And I'd be willing to the will of the committee, let's move this forward and continue to address any issues. But I feel very, very strongly this is a good bill.
Thank you, Chairman. We did have a few hands pop up. Representative Clemens, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman White, based on what you said, it sounds like you think that all the problems our schools are facing with performance are the result of the funding structure of our educational funding structure at the state level. Is that right? Did you mean to imply that?
If I did, I absolutely
Chairman White?
did. Thank you. If I did imply that, absolutely not. Funding, I'm a strong believer that money is a resource you need, but it doesn't fix anything. We fix it through proper leadership, through proper accountability. But you've got to have the funding to go along with it. So absolutely not. Funding is needed, but it is not what changes anything.
Representative Clemens, follow up.
Thank you. And when you say funding, do you mean funding or spending?
Chairman White?
Okay, let's don't play around with words here.
Well, no, I mean, it's a funding plan versus a spending plan. That's been said over and over. So my question is, you said funding, so I'm just.
What we as a state appropriate for K through 12 and higher education is what I'm referring to.
Representative Clemens?
And do you think that we are intending here through this formula to appropriate enough money for public education in Tennessee, regardless of the structure?
Chairman White?
So your question is, do I think we are, ask that one more time.
Representative Clemens?
Do you think $1 billion is sufficient to fund education in Tennessee, regardless of the formula?
Chairman White?
Now, I wouldn't put a dollar figure. That's where the administration has offered $1 billion when many states are cutting back because they outspent in the past. We are a very conservative state. We're growing. We're very blessed. So we have $1 billion to put in right now. My wish in the coming years that we continue to put more and more money into education. Is that important? We're nowhere near where we need to be as a state. We all know that. But the $1 billion is what we had to work with right now. And so we'll accept that and do the best we can.
Let's clarify, that's $1 billion additional dollars. That's what we're referring
Yes,
to.
Yeah, the total budget was $9 billion, Commissioner. $9 billion. Now, this will be $1 billion additional dollars that we've never done that I know of in the history of the state at one time.
Representative Clemens, one.
Thank you. And, $1 billion is a lot of money, but considering we over collected 1.8 billion just between August and January alone, and this year in state sales taxes, we're sitting at over 6 billion in the general and recurring fund for education alone. And we've got a rainy day fund of 1.55 billion. I mean, yeah, $1 billion is a lot of money, but we have the money to invest in education regardless of the fund. So I know you don't want to put a dollar amount on it about what we should be investing, but I think the consistent thing we heard, even from the directors of schools that we heard here from in the sub and here, is that they need a bigger pie. And what we're focused on here, I think we'll agree, is how to slice that pie up and how to distribute it. And I think we're failing to accomplish some of the inherent or resolve some of the inherent flaws with the BEP. And we're not addressing any of the equity issues. And we also just some of these unknowns. That's my last question to you is, do all of the unknowns in this legislation not make you lose sleep at night? We don't know what outcome goals are. We don't know what direct allocation amounts are. We don't know any of the corrective action, what's possible on that front. A lot of this is contingent on future rulemaking and subject to available funds. And you're right. Some people have already announced they're not going to be here next year. So we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And we don't know who's going to be government operations or, looking over those rules and so forth. So does none of those unknowns make you lose sleep at night and give you pause in pushing through this rushed legislation? Chairman White now.
Thank you. Number one, I don't think it's rushed. It's been worked on and talked about for many years. I would answer your question, but also asking you, do you feel comfortable where we currently are in the current funding formula? We've got the same questions with the current formula. And what we are doing is we are allowing districts the flexibility to take more money and spend it the way that will fit their students in their district. So those things I do feel good. Have I ever felt good? The same thing with the BEP formula, the 47 metrics and resource funding and on and on and on. We could ask the very same questions on that. But this is a much simpler formula based upon student needs, which I think will go a long way in addressing our problem. As far as the amount of money, you'll take that up with administration. We have $1 billion extra being offered to us, and so we will just move on with that.
Chairman Sapiki, you are recognized. Chairman Sapiki, let's hold up. He did refer one question. I'll give Representative Clemens a chance to answer that.
Yeah, so to answer your question, again, I directly answer your question that you asked me is, I don't think this is an either or. I don't think this is a BEP, and I don't think TISA are the only two options. And if the administration is to be believed, they've only been working on this for 6 months. So I do think it's rushed. I don't think they've been working on it for years if they say what they say is accurate. So I don't want to get trapped into this false narrative of if you think the BEP is great or this is better, because that's not our only options. I think that we all can take our time. I mean, we just slapped 5 new amendments on. We don't even know what the fiscal note of the bill is as it entered this committee today. There is no fiscal note. So I think taking our time, slowing this down, all of us sitting around, we digested a lot of information in the last 4 weeks in our subcommittee and full committee. And not all of us have had every question we've asked answered. Our chairmen have been great and been patient with people like me, I will openly admit. But I do think this is rushed. And I do think there are too many unknowns. And I got to tell you, I've got a lot of uncomfortable constituents and hearing from people across the state of Tennessee, not just in Davidson County with this. So I just would caution my colleagues please, let's not rush this. Let's take our time with this. And next January, the commissioner said we can change this next January. So thank you. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Chairman White, you have a response to that?
No, I appreciate the comments. The thing I would just comment on too, and anything like this, you've got to have a starting point and move forward. Now, in the bill, the legislation is this would not go into effect to 2023, 2024. And so if you put something out there and then you start doing the policies, and if you do find issues, as we discussed earlier, you can address those. But until you get to that point, you never get to that point. I sat on the BEP review committee after Chairman Harry Brooks left for a number of years, and we continually asked these same questions, trying to, how do you fix the BEP formula? And we could look for more money and all these things, but we never got there. And I appreciate the administration bringing this to a point that we can address a lot of the issues that we've had. So to answer the question, I do feel comfortable at this point.
Chairman Sapiki, you are recognized.
Thank you very much. This is rushed. No matter how you look at it, it's rushed. Ever since we've gotten this bill, there's been amendment after amendment after amendment on this bill, trying to get in the right position. I think we're headed that way. I think with a little bit more time, we've just, like you said, we've just added a bunch of amendments here. There's many members to this committee that really haven't been involved in the day-to-day or the week-to-week debate on this bill and listening to the testimony. We've had two superintendents come forward, and one of them talked about he's so happy he's getting $6 million, and the one today talked about $4.2 million and paying teachers more. But nobody's talking about outcomes. How are we going to get more kids proficient? And I have a school board chairman and I have a county commission budget chairman that are telling me their questions are not getting answered. I represent my district. My district is telling me they're not getting their answers. It's rushed. We don't know the consequences or unintended outcomes. Nobody can sit here and tell me what the unintended outcomes are because we don't know. They want us to pass this bill, and I've been told this. Pass the bill, and whatever's wrong, we'll fix in the future. That has an eerie ring to it of things that we stand against. I think if we have more time, we're not even in flow motion yet. I think if we have more time, we can get this bill to where we want it. And for that reason, if we're going to vote today to move this out, I can't support it for one reason. My district is not in a position that they're comfortable with this bill. The question I have for the bill sponsor is, and it's one that you've asked many people who stood in your position, due to the fact that we've had, I believe, I could be wrong, 4 bill rewrites, 8 amendments in the last 2 weeks. 4 bill rewrites since we've seen it, and 8 amendments in the last 2 weeks. Will you commit to this committee that if this bill changes at all in GovOps, finance, you'll bring this bill back to us?
Chairman White.
First of all, let me say this. We said the will of the committee. When you say we're moving too fast, if you're talking about continuing on to discuss this session, or if you're talking about next year, that's what I was referring to. I'm not pushing this committee tonight on one way or the other. I want everybody to get their questions answered. But to answer your question, as far as when we this is a process, and when we got it, that shows the flexibility and how much the administration, the department, as well as the committee is listening to all the stakeholders. That's why we've had several rewrites, and then we've added amendments as things come along. So no, I'm not pushing this bill out tonight, but I do think that we are far enough along that we can do that this year and not keep putting it off. My only concern is that on something of this magnitude, you keep having amendment after amendment after amendment, and pretty soon you mess up the very thing that made it a good bill. So that would be my concern.
Chairman Sapiki, you recognized.
One could argue that the reason for all the amendments is because of the way the bill was presented to us in the first place. And so we're trying to fix this with interaction from our superintendents, and our school boards and from teachers and practical implementation of how this is going to work out. And you made a comment that we're asking repetitive questions week after week, and it could be because we're feeling we're not getting the answers to be able to go back and tell our school board members and our county commissions, no, this is how it's going to work and it's going to be okay. So we're not even to flow motion yet. Every time we've had one of these meetings in subcommittee, we've come back the following week with more amendments because people have had time to listen to what was said, and then it brings up issues that we're continuing to fix. If we can get it to the point that it's in the right position and we all like it and it's good, we move it forward. I guess the question that you didn't answer was, if this bill does move forward, as this committee would vote on it, and there's an amendment further on down the line, would you commit to bring that back to this committee like we've asked other people standing in your position?
Chairman White.
Yeah, this is the Education Committee's bill. I sat on one committee one time where we voted on a bill and it went to finance and got totally changed and didn't come back to education. And what we voted on was a different bill when it came out of there. So no, I would totally agree with you on that if we continue to go forward. But there again, I'm at the will of the committee. When we feel comfortable that we have something moving forward better, it doesn't have to be tonight, if it's next week. But I do think we're at a point in time where we don't need to lose this golden opportunity to do something this session while we have spent all this time on it. If you start over next year, you've got a whole new group and you start the educational process again. And I don't know if you ever get there. And so I just think we're at a time and place to do something.
Chairman Sapiki.
And I agree with you. And I think we're at a point right now where we have to come back here next week no matter what, because we still have a calendar to finish up. And I think we've got our task in front of us. If there's no other amendments next week and everybody's ready to go, I think we have to vote to see if we're going to move it out or not. And so we can make a motion to adjourn. Motion to adjourn.
Take the vote. I'm sorry. Take the vote to adjourn. Okay. We have an objection to motion to adjourn. It is non-debatable, so we will be voting on the motion to adjourn, members. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Ayes have it.
Thank you very much, committee.
Members, I want to make a statement right now. I want to instruct legal to roll all the amendments into one moving forward. And all the bills on the calendar next week.